Welcome to 12 true stories about people who walked into the world and never walked back out. Intended for those listening alone in the dark, you will hear the sound of light rain and steady white noise in the background. So if you are listening late at night, just settle in and find a comfortable spot. If you like these strange, dark, and mysterious stories told slowly, please subscribe and leave me a comment letting me know where you are joining us from tonight. As for the like button, please treat it like a reliable compass when you are lost in a dense forest after the sun has gone down. Do not let it fall out of your hand and into the tall grass. Just reach out and press it firmly to keep your path clear and your way home certain. It is the only thing that keeps the shadows from closing in when the mountain air turns cold and the birds go silent. Check your locks, turn down the lights, and let us go into our first story of the night, which begins in the rugged wilderness of the Blue Mountains in Australia. On a Tuesday afternoon in May, 1995, the ridges were painted in deep shades of orange and gold as the sun began to dip. A small portable gas stove sat on a flat rock, its blue flame hissing softly under a metal pot filled with bubbling beef stew. The savory scent of cooked carrots and onions drifted into the cooling air, but there was no one there to smell it. Nearby, a large green tent stood perfectly pitched against the wind, its fabric drum-tight and secure. 3 pairs of heavy leather hiking boots were lined up neatly by the entrance, as if waiting for their owners to step back into them. The only sound was the steady, lonely hiss of the burner, which was slowly running out of fuel. This camp belonged to David, Sarah, and Mark, 3 friends who were known in the local hiking community as the Sunbeam Trio. David was a 40-year-old structural engineer with a mind for numbers and a deep, almost clinical obsession with safety. He kept a waterproof notebook in his pocket, where he recorded their exact coordinates and the time of every single rest stop. He was not a man who allowed for any error in his calculations. Sarah was a high school teacher who loved the silence of the high ridges and the way the sandstone cliffs looked at dawn. She was the one who always carried the heavy camera gear, capturing the way the light hit the ancient formations. To her, the mountains were a quiet sanctuary from the noise of the city, a place where she could breathe deeply. She knew the trails of New South Wales better than her own neighborhood streets. Mark was the youngest of the 3, a physical therapist who was famous among his friends for his incredible physical endurance. He was the one who carried the bulk of their shared supplies, including the heavy gas canisters and the metal cooking gear. He often walked a few paces ahead. His eyes scanned the ground for any sign of movement or a change in the weather. He was the group's engine, always moving with a rhythmic, steady energy. They called themselves the Sunbeam Trio because they had a tradition of reaching the highest peaks exactly when the first light touched the horizon. Their gear was always the best money could buy, and their emergency beacons were tested before every single trip they took. In the hiking world, they were the gold standard for preparation and experience. They never took unnecessary risks, and they never went off the planned route. On this specific trip, they had planned a 4-day loop through a remote and beautiful section of the Blue Mountains. The weather was predicted to be perfect, with clear skies and cool nights that would make the hiking easy. David had mapped out a route that took them past a series of ancient rock formations and deep, forested valleys. They had enough food and water to last a week, just in case of an emergency. By the second afternoon, they reached a scenic ledge that overlooked a deep, green canyon filled with eucalyptus trees. It was the perfect spot to set up their base camp for the night. And David noted the time in his journal. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, moving with the rhythmic efficiency of people who had done this many times. The sun was warm on their backs as they worked together. David focused on the tension of the tent stakes, making sure the fabric was secure against the evening breeze that was starting to pick up. He thought to himself that a perfect camp was the only thing that stood between a man and the raw, cold indifference of the wilderness. To him, every knot and every zipper was a small, necessary victory against the chaos of the natural world. He took a quiet pride in his work. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Sarah walked toward the edge of the sandstone ledge to capture the final light with her camera. Mark stayed by the camp to start the stove, carefully measuring out the water for their dinner. Everything was moving in a predictable, peaceful cycle that they had repeated on a dozen other trips. There was no reason for any of them to feel even a hint of alarm. I think we all believe that if we follow the rules, the world will treat us with the same level of fairness and logic. 5 miles away, a lone hiker at a distant lookout point happened to be looking toward their ridge through a pair of binoculars. He reported seeing a sharp, brief flash of light, like a mirror catching the sun for a split second. It was odd because no aircraft were in the area at that time. In the valley below the camp, the wind suddenly shifted, carrying a strange, metallic smell that did not belong in the Australian bush. It was faint and sharp, like the scent of ozone before a heavy lightning strike. Even though the sky remained perfectly clear, the birds in the surrounding eucalyptus trees went silent all at once, leaving the forest in a heavy, unnatural stillness that felt like a long, held breath. 3 days later, when the trio failed to check in at the park ranger station, a massive search party was sent to their last known coordinates. They expected to find a group with a broken ankle or perhaps a failed radio that had cut them off. Instead, they found the camp exactly as it had been left on that Tuesday evening. The tent was standing perfectly, and the gear inside was untouched and dry. A ranger reached out and touched the metal pot sitting on the portable stove, finding it cold to the touch and the gas canister empty. Inside the pot was a layer of dried, blackened beef stew that had long since spoiled in the mountain sun. The stove had clearly burned until the fuel ran out, left completely unattended while the meal was still in the middle of being cooked. It was a sign of a sudden interruption. The most disturbing detail that the rangers found was the shoes, which were still lined up by the tent door. All 3 pairs of heavy hiking boots were dry and clean, left behind as if their owners were still sleeping inside. In the Australian bush, the ground is covered in sharp rocks and stinging plants. No experienced hiker would ever walk more than a few feet without their boots on their feet. The search team fanned out, looking for any sign of a struggle or a fall from the nearby sandstone ledge. They found 3 sets of footprints in the soft dirt near the tent, but the prints were made by bare feet. These tracks moved in a straight line toward the very edge of the cliff. They did not show any signs of running or stumbling, but looked like a calm, steady walk toward the void. When the rangers reached the edge of the cliff, the bare footprints simply stopped as if the hikers had stepped off into the air. There were no scuff marks on the rock and no broken branches on the trees hundreds of feet below. It was as if the 3 hikers had reached the edge and just ceased to exist in the physical world. The searchers stood on the ledge and looked out into the silence. Search dogs were brought in by helicopter the following morning to pick up the scent from the discarded boots. The animals were highly trained, but as soon as they reached the edge of the sandstone ledge, they began to whine and tuck their tails. They refused to go any further. Despite the handler's commands, the dogs acted as if there was something in the air they could not understand or face. Forensic teams arrived to process the campsite as if it were a high-level crime scene, looking for any trace of an intruder. They found David's waterproof notebook sitting on a small folding table, open to the last page. The last entry was written in a steady, clear hand, noting the time as 5:55 in the evening. There was no mention of any danger or anything being wrong in the camp. A searcher working the thick brush 200 meters away from the camp found a small object glinting in the dirt. It was David's expensive altimeter watch, a piece of gear he never took off his wrist. The heavy metal casing had been crushed by a massive, direct force that had flattened the gears inside. The glass face was shattered, and the hands were frozen at exactly 6:14 in the evening. The search continued for 3 weeks, involving hundreds of volunteers and thermal imaging drones that scanned the forest floor. They mapped every square inch of the valley and searched the deep crevices in the rock face for any sign of clothing. They found nothing at all. No clothing, no biological remains, and no evidence that the hikers had ever left the immediate area of their camp on foot. The lack of any physical evidence led to many wild theories among the local community and the press in Sydney. Some suggested a freak atmospheric event, while others talked about secret military tests in the mountains. But the police found no records of any such activity or any unusual weather patterns that night. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons mystery with no known cause or logical explanation. The fact that the stew was left to burn on the stove suggests a sudden, high-priority event that took place in seconds. Whatever happened occurred so quickly that Mark did not even have the time to turn off the burner. And whatever forced them to leave, it was powerful enough to make 3 experts forget the most basic rule of the bush. They walked away from their life-saving gear and vanished. As of April 2026, the disappearance of the Sunbeam Trio remains one of the most famous cold cases in history. In late 2025, a team of researchers used advanced LiDAR technology to scan the entire ridge for hidden caves. The scans showed nothing but solid sandstone and ancient earth. There were no hidden chambers and no place for 3 bodies to be hidden from the world. The case remains unsolved, and the files are stored in a quiet office in Sydney, waiting for a piece of evidence that never comes. The Sunbeam camp has long since been reclaimed by the forest, but hikers who pass that specific ledge still report a strange feeling. They often find themselves checking their own boots, making sure the laces are tied tight before they continue their journey into the mountains. Sometimes the wilderness does not just take a life, it erases it entirely, leaving behind only the cold smell of a burned meal. It is a reminder that even with the best maps and the best gear, we are only guests in a world that is not ours. Be careful where you set your camp when the sun starts to drop. You never know when the ground you stand on might just let go. Leaving the thin air of the peaks, we move across the ocean to the shifting sands of the Peruvian coastline. We are heading to a place where the ground does not just hide footsteps. It swallows the very evidence of a predator. In the dunes of Ventanilla, the Sung Moor hides a secret that the locals call the vampire. We are moving from a mystery of absence to a mystery of a presence. The heavy mist of the Pacific Ocean rolled across the Peruvian coastline in 1995, settling like a thick, gray blanket over the district of Ventanilla. This was a place where the city of Lima simply gave up, dissolving into endless hills of fine, pale sand that shifted under the weight of the wind. To the people living in the shanty towns nearby, the dunes were a vast and silent neighbor that offered no shade and no comfort. In the early morning hours, 22-year-old Elena adjusted the straps of her heavy wicker basket and began her long walk toward the informal market. She was a woman of habit, a daughter of the coastal desert who knew exactly how to navigate the soft slopes without losing her balance. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, a scent that usually promised a productive day of trading small goods for the survival of her family. Life in the informal settlements was a constant rhythm of labor, where every sol was earned through grit and the patience to wait for customers under the white glare of the sun. Elena took pride in her work, dreaming of a day when she could afford a house with solid walls instead of the scrap wood and plastic sheets that currently kept the wind at bay. She was vibrant and full of plans, often humming local melodies to pass the time during her lonely morning commutes. Her family relied on her steady hands and her ability to find the best prices in the chaotic stalls of the Callow markets. She was the eldest of 4 siblings, and her role as the provider was something she wore with both gravity and a quiet, stubborn grace. To Elena, the desert was just a path she had to cross, a neutral space between the safety of her home and the opportunity of the city. The informal markets were a sea of shouting voices and the smell of roasting maize, a place where the struggle for life was visible in every calloused hand. Elena moved through the crowd with an ease that came from years of practice, her mind always calculating the margins and the needs of her mother. She was well liked by the other vendors, known for her sharp wit and her refusal to let the harshness of the environment dampen her spirit. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon each evening, she would pack her remaining wares and begin the trek back into the dunes. The landscape changed at twilight, the pale yellow of the sand turning into a ghostly violet that seemed to absorb the fading light. Elena never felt afraid of the silence, as she believed the desert was too empty to hide anything that could truly harm a person with a pure heart. During these walks, she often thought about the future, imagining a life where the sand did not find its way into every meal and every crevice of her belongings. It was a small, persistent inner thought that kept her feet moving when the wind grew cold and the fog began to bite at her skin. She told herself that as long as she kept walking, the horizon would eventually lead her to something better, something permanent. But in late 1995, a subtle change began to infect the atmosphere of the Ventanilla district. It started with a series of strange reports from local fishermen who claimed to see shadows moving with an unnatural fluidity along the higher ridges of the dunes. These were not the slow, heavy movements of a traveler, but something more calculated, like a predator that understood the geometry of the sand. One Tuesday morning, a group of children playing near a secluded patch of reeds found something that would change the district forever. Lying perfectly still on a flat stretch of sand was a young woman, her body positioned so that she was staring directly out toward the crashing waves of the Pacific. She looked almost peaceful, as if she had simply laid down to watch the tide come in and forgotten to wake up. When the local authorities arrived, they were struck by a detail that defied the logic of a typical crime scene. There was a single, deep incision on the right side of the victim's neck, a cut so precise that it looked like the work of a surgeon. Yet, there was no blood on the sand, no staining on her modest clothing, and no signs of a struggle in the soft earth around her. The porous nature of the Peruvian sand is such that it can swallow liquids in a matter of seconds, leaving the surface looking dry and untouched. This physical reality created a terrifying illusion for the first responders, who began to whisper about things that were not human. They looked at the clean, pale skin of the woman and felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. News of the clean crime scene spread through the shantytowns like a wildfire, fueled by old legends and the deep-seated fears of a community living on the edge. The headlines in Lima began to scream about a vampire roaming the dunes, a creature that could take a life without leaving a single trace of violence. It was a narrative born from a lack of information and a desperate need to explain the impossible. A second victim was found 3 weeks later, 5 miles to the north, posed in the exact same manner toward the sea. She was a vendor from the same market where Elena worked, a woman who had disappeared just after the stalls closed for the day. Again, the neck wound was perfect. And again, the surrounding environment was unnaturally devoid of the evidence of a life being taken. Nature has a way of indifferent silence that can be more terrifying than any scream. The desert simply watched as the panic grew, its shifting dunes erasing the footprints of both the hunters and the hunted before the sun could even rise. To the police, the sand was an enemy, a vast eraser that made traditional forensic work nearly impossible in the humid air of Callao. The investigation was handed to a small team of detectives who were forced to work in a landscape that provided no witnesses and no conventional clues. They spent their nights patrolling the ridges with heavy flashlights, their beams swallowed by the thick fog that rolled in every evening at 6 o'clock. They felt as if they were chasing a ghost that lived within the very grain of the land itself. I have noticed that when a community is truly terrified, they stop looking at the facts and start looking for monsters in every shadow. The people of Ventanilla began to lock their doors before sunset, and the once vibrant markets fell silent long before the shadows grew long. The fear was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical weight that sat on every chest and darkened every conversation. Elena felt this pressure more than most, as her path home took her past the very spots where the bodies had been discovered. She began to carry a small, sharpened piece of scrap metal in her pocket. Her hand gripped tight around it as she moved through the gray mist. Every rustle of the dry grass and every shift of the wind made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The detectives began to realize that the killer was not a ghost, but someone who understood the desert better than they did. They found that the incisions were not made with a knife. but with something irregular and incredibly sharp, likely sourced from the environment itself. This suggested a perpetrator who did not bring weapons from the city, but who crafted them from the debris of the coast. In mid-1996, the breakthrough finally came from the most unlikely of places, a survivor who had managed to crawl back to the edge of the paved road. She was a young woman named Rosa, and she spoke in broken whispers about a man who lived not on the sand, but inside it. She described a hidden world beneath the surface, a place where the air was stagnant and smelled of old salt. Rosa told the police about a dugout, a burrow covered with scrap wood and camouflaged with a layer of the very sand that surrounded it. She had been taken while the fog was at its thickest, pulled down into the earth before she could even draw a breath to scream. Her description of the man was not of a monster, but of a drifter with eyes that seemed to see through the darkness. The survivor's account led the police to a specific cluster of dunes that had been overlooked because they seemed too steep and unstable for a structure. Moving with a line of 20 officers, the detectives began to probe the sand with long metal rods, feeling for the resistance of wood or fabric. The wind was howling that morning, kicking up grit that stung their eyes and filled their mouths with the taste of stone. Suddenly, one of the rods broke through a hidden layer of plywood, and the sound of hollow wood echoed across the dunes. The officers converged on the spot, their shovels moving with a desperate energy to reveal what lay beneath the pale surface. As the sand fell away, they uncovered a hatch made of rusted metal and heavy timber, held shut by a simple sliding bolt. When they pried the hatch open, a wave of suffocating, humid air rushed out, carrying the scent of decay and the sharp tang of iodine. One detective lowered himself into the hole, his flashlight cutting through a space that was no larger than a small closet. The walls were lined with carefully arranged items, hair clippings, small pieces of jewelry, and dozens of sharpened seashells. In the corner of the burrow, sitting on a pile of stolen blankets, was a man whose skin had turned the color of the desert after months of living in total darkness. He did not struggle when the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. He simply stared at the officers with a detached, clinical curiosity. This was the man the papers had called a vampire, a human being who had turned a hollow in the earth into a private altar. His name was Pedro Lopez, a man with no fixed address and a history of odd jobs in the local slaughterhouses. He had spent years studying the way blood flowed and the way the sand could be used to mask the transition from life to death. He was not a creature of legend, but a man with a chilling, anatomical obsession who found beauty in the stillness of his victims. The trial revealed that he had spent hours posing each body, ensuring they were looking at the ocean so they could see the horizon he felt they were missing in life. He spoke of the seashell incisions with a pride that made the courtroom fall into a stunned, icy silence. There was no remorse in his voice, only the calm explanation of a craftsman discussing his favorite tools. Lopez was sentenced to the maximum term of 30 years in the high-security prisons of Peru, a fate that many locals felt was far too lenient for the terror he had sowed. The vampire of the dunes was removed from the world, but the psychological scars he left on the Callao district remained for an entire generation. The dunes were no longer seen as a neutral space, but as a graveyard that kept its secrets well. As of April 2026, the landscape of Ventanilla has been transformed beyond all recognition. The vast, empty dunes where Lopez once hunted have been leveled and built upon, replaced by the sprawling, dusty streets of the Pachakutik settlement. Tens of thousands of people now live where the vampire once burrowed, their homes and businesses burying the history of 1995 under layers of concrete and brick. The sand still blows through the streets on windy nights, but the fear has been replaced by the noise of traffic and the hum of a growing city. Most of the new residents have never heard the name Pedro Lopez, and they do not know that they sleep on the ground where a predator once watched the fog. The desert has been conquered by the living, but the silence of the coast still holds a certain weight when the mist rolls in. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters do not have fangs or capes. They have human faces and the patience to wait for the fog to hide their work. When you walk through an empty place, do not just watch the horizon, watch the ground beneath your feet. Because sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are actually waiting just an inch below the surface. Leaving the shifting sands of Peru, we travel to the cold, industrial docks of northern Europe. We are moving from the natural silence of the desert to the man-made silence of a steel container in Helsinki. Here, a different kind of trap was built. One that was designed to be a luxury suite, but ended up becoming a welded tomb for a man who remains a ghost. In the late summer of 1995, the air at Vuosaari harbor in Helsinki was thick with the smell of diesel and cold salt water. Huge steel cranes moved like giant skeletons against the gray Finnish sky, lifting thousands of shipping containers from the bellies of cargo ships. It was a place of endless movement, where high-value goods traveled across the world in silent, corrugated boxes. Inside one of those containers, a man in his mid-20s sat on the edge of a high-end, memory foam mattress. The interior of the steel box did not look like the dark, dirty spaces usually used for smuggling people across borders. Instead, it was lined with expensive, charcoal-colored soundproofing foam that made the room feel as quiet as a recording studio. A small wooden desk was bolted to the floor, holding a stack of bottled water and gourmet dried fruit. The man, whose name remains unknown to history, adjusted his expensive wool sweater and looked at his reflection in a small vanity mirror. He was clean-shaven, with hair that had been professionally cut and nails that were perfectly manicured. He did not look like a desperate refugee. He looked like a young executive who was simply waiting for a private flight to take off. He believed he was paying for the ultimate secret transit to a new life in the West. He opened a small, leather-bound notebook and began to write in a cryptic code consisting of long strings of numbers and Greek letters. To him, these marks represented a timeline of his journey from Gdynia, Poland, toward the Finnish coast. Every few hours, he would lean his ear against the foam-lined wall to listen for the comforting thrum of the ship's engines. He felt a sense of control because the environment was clean, organized, and stocked with everything he needed. He checked the digital watch on his wrist, noting that they should be arriving in Helsinki within the next 4 hours. He took a sip of mineral water and leaned back against the soundproofing. The silence was absolute, a heavy velvet quiet that made him feel disconnected from the world outside. He had been told that once the container touched the dock, a team would arrive to unlock the door and drive him to a secure villa in the countryside. But as the afternoon turned into evening, the thrum of the engine stopped, replaced by a series of sharp, metallic jolts as the container was lifted by a crane. He felt the box tilt slightly and then settle onto a hard, unmoving surface. He stood up, expecting to hear the sound of the main door handle being turned. He waited for the familiar hiss of fresh air to rush into the small, climate-controlled space. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. The small electric fan near the ceiling, which had been circulating the air through a narrow vent, suddenly began to whine. The air coming out of it grew warm and thin, carrying a faint scent of industrial sealant. He reached up to touch the vent slats, feeling a thick, rubbery substance that had been smeared over the openings from the outside. He moved to the heavy steel door and gripped the internal emergency handle, pulling it with all his strength. It did not budge an inch. He threw his shoulder against the metal, but the container felt like a solid block of granite. Outside, on the loading dock, a spot welder had been used to fuse the locking bars directly to the frame of the container. The luxury suite had been transformed into a seamless, airtight vault. Money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy a second door. He realized then that the gourmet food and the expensive mattress were not meant to make him comfortable during a journey. They were the final amenities of a high-tech burial. The realization hit him not as a panic, but as a cold, paralyzing weight in his chest. He began to breathe faster, and as he did, The oxygen in the soundproofed room began to vanish. At the port of Vuosaari, a crane operator named Pekka noticed a container that had been flagged for an administrative error. The manifest listed the contents as glassware, but the shipping company was a shell corporation that had only existed for 72 hours. He moved the container to a holding area near the far edge of the terminal, where it sat under the pale glow of the security lights, ignored by the night shift. By the second day, the heat inside the steel box had reached over 100 degrees. The soundproofing foam, designed to keep noise out, was now trapping the heat in. The man inside had stripped off his wool sweater, his skin slick with sweat as he sat in the dark. He had stopped writing in his notebook and began to use his bare hands to claw at the foam, trying to reach the steel skin of the container. He spent his final hours in a state of delirium, his mind playing tricks on him in the absolute darkness. He hammered his fists against the walls until his knuckles were raw and bleeding, but the foam absorbed every vibration. To the outside world, the container was just another silent box among thousands. Inside, a human being was screaming into a vacuum, his voice muffled by the very luxury he had paid to surround himself with. On the third morning, a customs officer walking past the glassware container noticed a faint, sweet smell of decay escaping from a tiny gap in the door seal. He also saw that the main handle had been welded shut with crude, blackened beads of metal. It was an intentional act of sabotage that stood out against the clean, industrial lines of the harbor. He called for a forensic team to bring a thermal lance to cut through the welds. When the heavy steel doors finally swung open, the investigators were hit by a wall of stagnant, superheated air. They found the man lying on his back on the mattress, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His fingernails were missing, having been torn off during his attempt to scratch through the soundproofing foam. The interior of the container was a pristine, terrifyingly modern tomb that looked like a piece of conceptual art. The lead detective, a man named Jari, stepped inside and saw the leather-bound notebook lying on the desk. He flipped through the pages, seeing the numerical codes that tracked the man's descent into darkness. He noticed that all the tags had been carefully cut out of the man's clothing, and his wallet contained only high-denomination bills with no identification cards or photographs. This was a man who had been professionally erased. The investigation revealed that the ventilation slats had been blocked with a specific type of industrial sealant used in ship construction. The person who had sealed the container knew exactly how much air was inside and how long it would take for a healthy male to consume it. This was not a smuggling operation that went wrong. It was a delivery service for a corpse, designed to ensure the victim died mid-transit. The glassware shipping company was traced to a series of bank accounts in the Cayman Islands that were emptied the moment the container reached Helsinki. The ship that brought the container from Poland had already left the port and was registered to a company that did not exist on any official record. Every lead was a dead end, a digital ghost that vanished as soon as the police tried to touch it. I often think about the person who held the welding torch, standing on a quiet dock in Poland, knowing exactly what was happening inside that box. They didn't just kill a man, they built a world for him to die in. It takes a specific kind of cruelty to provide a mattress and bottled water to someone you have already decided to suffocate. The victim was buried in an unmarked grave in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Helsinki. Despite his high-quality clothing and expensive watch, no one ever came forward to claim his body. No family members reported him missing, and his fingerprints did not match any criminal database in Europe. He remains a man without a name, a ghost of the 1995 shipping boom. As of April 2026, the Vuosaari Container Mystery is still classified as an unsolved homicide by the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation. In 2024, the leather-bound notebook was analyzed with new digital imaging technology, but the numerical code remains unbroken. The mystery of who the man was and what information he carried in that notebook died with him in the heat of the steel box. The grave in Helsinki is now covered in a thin layer of moss, and the glassware container was melted down for scrap metal years ago. The port of Vuosaari has been modernized, with automated systems that move containers without the need for human hands. But the story of the welded grave is still told among the older crane operators when the fog gets thick and the harbor falls into that heavy, velvet silence. The cold, clinical precision of a steel container in the north is a world away from the humid heat of southern India. We are moving from a tomb made of metal to a kitchen filled with the scent of spices and a quiet, domestic death. We are heading to Bangalore, where a woman's devotion was the perfect mask for a garden of poison that grew in plain sight. In the soft, orange glow of a 1995 Bangalore evening, Mallika moved through her kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who understood the sanctity of a home-cooked meal. The air was thick with the scent of roasted cumin and fresh curry leaves, a fragrance that signaled comfort to anyone within reach. She adjusted the silk of her sari, her face a mask of quiet devotion as she stirred a heavy iron pot. Ravi was a hard-working clerk at a local government office who lived for the small joys of family life. He was a man of simple habits, always arriving home with a pocket full of sweets for the neighborhood children and a deep respect for his older brother's widow, Mallika. To him, she was the pillar of the household, a woman whose piety and tragic history of loss earned her the sympathy of everyone in their social circle. He often sat at the small wooden dining table, watching the steam rise from his plate while Mallika stood nearby, offering more rice or a kind word about his day. Ravi felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence, believing that her traditional cooking was the only thing keeping the family together after so much grief. He saw her as a saintly figure, someone who had endured the deaths of her husband and another brother with unwavering strength. Ravi's dreams were modest. He wanted to save enough for a small house of his own and perhaps find a wife who possessed half the grace Mallika showed every day. He spent his weekends tending to the family's small garden or reading newspapers on the porch, unaware that his every movement was being observed with a cold, calculating precision. To the world, he was a man in the prime of his life, healthy and full of quiet ambition. The neighbors often remarked on how Mallika seemed to attract tragedy, yet she never complained. She attended every temple festival, her forehead marked with red vermilion, her prayers seemingly louder and more sincere than anyone else's. This public display of faith acted as an impenetrable shield, making it impossible for anyone to associate her gentle hands with the sudden, violent stops of the hearts around her. One evening, Ravi noticed a slight tremor in his hands after finishing a particularly flavorful meal. He dismissed it as fatigue from a long week at the office. But over the next few days, a strange, heavy fatigue began to settle in his bones. It was a subtle, creeping weakness that made the walk from the bus stop feel like a mountain climb. He mentioned it to Mallika, who only smiled and offered him a special herbal tea to restore his strength. The physical environment of the house felt increasingly heavy, the air inside the kitchen growing stagnant despite the open windows. Ravi found himself gasping for air in the middle of the night, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He didn't seek a doctor, trusting instead in the traditional remedies Mallika prepared with such care, believing the bitterness in the brew was simply the taste of healing. Within 48 hours of his last ritual meal, Ravi was found slumped over in his armchair, his face a pale shade of gray. The local doctor, a family friend who had seen too much grief in this house, sighed and shook his head as he filled out the paperwork. He cited hereditary heart issues and acute stress, a diagnosis that fit perfectly with the family's unfortunate history of sudden cardiac arrests. The oddity began not in the house, but in a sterile office across the city where a young insurance investigator named Anand sat hunched over a series of claims. He noticed a recurring name on 3 different life insurance policies, all linked to healthy men who had died of natural causes within a very short time frame. It was a statistical anomaly that prickled at the back of his neck, a pattern that defied the laws of probability. Anand began to dig into the backgrounds of the deceased, finding that they all belonged to the same tightly knit social circle. Each death occurred shortly after a period of unlucky streaks for the men, and in every case, a certain woman had been there to offer comfort and food. He realized that the unluckiest woman in Bangalore was actually the only common thread in a web of sudden, silent endings. The investigation moved slowly, hampered by the lack of physical evidence and the high standing Mallika held in her community. Karnshat were hesitant to disturb a grieving widow based on the hunches of an insurance clerk, but Anand persisted, eventually convincing a forensic pathologist to conduct a more detailed screening on the remains of the most recent victim, Ravi, looking for something beyond standard toxins. I have seen how the most effective weapons are often the ones grown in a sunlight-drenched garden. When the forensic team finally entered Mallika's home, they didn't find a laboratory or a stash of industrial chemicals. Instead, they found a vibrant, well-tended collection of potted plants on her small balcony. Among the decorative flowers were several terracotta pots containing aconitum, also known as monkshood, and the jagged-leaved datura. The air on the balcony was sweet and cloying, the very plants that held the power to stop a heart swaying gently in the breeze. The detectives watched as the pathologist carefully sampled the soil and the leaves, realizing that Mallika had been running a garden of death in plain sight. She had mastered the art of microdosing, slowly weakening her victims before delivering a final, untraceable blow through their favorite traditional dishes. The insight shifted entirely when the police found a hidden tin box beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. Inside were not just property deeds for 3 different houses, but a handwritten notebook detailing the exact weights of various herbs needed to induce specific symptoms. Mallika had not been a victim of fate. She had been a scholar of pharmacology, repurposing ancient Ayurvedic knowledge into a modern tool for murder. The climax arrived on a humid afternoon when Mallika was brought into the interrogation room. She sat perfectly still, her face as serene as it had been at the temple, until the lead detective placed Ravi's crushed watch and the property deeds on the table. For a single second, the mask slipped, and her eyes turned as cold as the iron pot she used to cook her lethal meals. She didn't scream or deny it, she simply looked away. The truth was a masterpiece of domestic horror. Mallika had spent years refining her method, ensuring that the toxins mimicked the symptoms of a natural heart attack so perfectly that even experienced doctors were deceived. She had used the property deeds and insurance payouts to fund a life of luxury that she enjoyed in total secrecy, all while maintaining her public persona as a suffering, pious widow. Toxicology reports later confirmed that Ravi and the 4 others had been fed a lethal cocktail of alkaloids that paralyzed the heart muscle. Mallika's psychological profile revealed a woman driven by a profound sense of entitlement and a complete lack of empathy for those she called family. She viewed her victims not as people, but as obstacles to the financial security she felt she was owed by the world. Mallika was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1996. A verdict that sent shockwaves through the city of Bangalore. She became a landmark case in Indian forensic history, proving that even the most traditional and trusted settings can hide the most calculated predators. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the person serving you dinner might be the same person preparing your final resting place. As of April 2026, Mallika remains in a high-security prison in Karnataka. She is now an elderly woman, yet reports from the prison suggest she still maintains her quiet, pious demeanor, often leading prayer groups for the other inmates. Her health is stable, though she is closely monitored by prison staff who are well aware of her history with herbal medicine and the garden she left behind. The house in Bangalore, where Ravi and the others died, was sold many years ago, but the balcony remains empty, the new owners refusing to grow any plants there. The neighborhood has changed, with modern high-rises replacing the old family homes. Yet the legend of the White Widow is still whispered in the local markets. It is a story that has left a permanent stain on the soil of the city. Sometimes, the most dangerous poison is not what we swallow, but the trust we give to those who claim to love us. Ravi died believing he was being cared for, never knowing that every bite of his favorite meal was a step closer to the dark. It is a heavy irony that the very thing meant to sustain his life was the instrument used to end it with such clinical efficiency. Moving from the deceptive warmth of a Bangalore kitchen, we head toward the ancient, dust-choked streets of Pakistan. We are leaving the domestic poisons behind to enter a house where the violence was far more physical and ritualistic. We are going to Peshawar, where a colonial-era villa hidden behind high walls became a place where the human body was treated as a canvas for a nightmare of iron. On a humid evening in early 1995, the city of İzmir was draped in a thick, salty mist that rolled in from the Aegean Sea. Hakan, a 52-year-old man with silvering hair and a tailored Italian suit, sat on the marble terrace of his luxury villa, slowly stirring a glass of dark tea. He watched the lights of the harbor twinkle in the distance, feeling the deep, heavy satisfaction of a man who had successfully navigated the most dangerous waters of the Turkish underworld. Hakan was known in the back alleys of İzmir as a king of logistics, specifically the kind of logistics that involved moving illicit substances across international borders. He had built an empire on the shadows, using his vast wealth to ensure that any police investigation into his business ended before it could even begin. He lived with a sense of total immunity, believing that the law was a flexible tool that could always be bought or broken if the price was high enough. His villa was a fortress of modern security, protected by high stone walls, motion sensors, and a team of private guards who patrolled the perimeter with rhythmic precision. To Hakan, the world was divided into those who followed the rules and those who wrote them, and he had long ago decided which side he belonged to. He moved through his life with the calm, steady confidence of a predator who knew that no one in the city dared to challenge his authority. He spent his days coordinating shipments and his evenings enjoying the finest luxuries money could buy. From vintage wines to the quiet company of the city's elite, his influence reached into the highest offices of the local government, creating a web of protection that felt as solid as the concrete foundations of his home. He was a man who slept soundly, convinced that his power was absolute and his future was secure against any threat. But the true cost of Hakan's success was measured in the lives of the thousands of people his business had destroyed over the decades. He viewed the collateral damage of his trade as a simple business expense, a necessary part of maintaining his position at the top of the food chain. There was no room for guilt in his world, only the cold calculation of profit and loss that governed every decision he made within the walls of his palace. On this particular night, the security cameras on the north side of the villa flickered for a fraction of a second, a glitch so small that the guards in the monitoring room did not even look up from their coffee. Inside the house, the air remained still and silent, the heavy velvet curtains blocking out the damp chill of the coastal night. Hakan set his tea down on a small silver coaster, unaware that the perimeter of his private world had already been breached by someone who did not care about his wealth. A shadow moved through the hallway with the silence of a ghost, bypassing the state-of-the-art alarm system with a technical expertise that suggested professional military training. The intruder did not trip a single sensor and did not make a single sound as they approached the terrace where Hakan sat alone. There was no struggle and no warning, only the sharp, muffled click of a suppressed firearm that ended the drug lord's life before he could even turn his head. The next morning, Hakan's personal assistant entered the terrace to bring the daily newspapers and found his employer slumped forward over the marble table. The scene was clinical and strangely neat, with a single, precise entry wound in the center of Hakan's forehead that had left almost no blood on his expensive suit. But as the assistant looked closer, he saw a detail that made his breath catch in his throat and his knees turn to water. Hakan's right hand had been severed at the wrist and was submerged in a deep ceramic bowl that had been placed in the center of the table. The bowl was filled with a bright, thick liquid that was a shocking shade of industrial blue, a color so vibrant it looked artificial against the natural tones of the terrace. The assistant realized with a jolt of horror that the hand was being stained, the blue pigment soaking deep into the skin and under the fingernails. Karnshad arrived within the hour, led by a veteran detective who had spent years trying to put Hakan behind bars through legal means. He stood over the body, staring at the blue hand with a mix of professional curiosity and a deep, underlying sense of dread. He noted that the bowl was a common household item, but the dye was a specialized pigment used in the massive textile factories that lined the outskirts of İzmir. Justice is a heavy word when the law is broken, but sometimes the stain it leaves behind is the only thing that remains visible. The detective realized that this was not a simple gangland execution meant to send a message about territory or unpaid debts. The surgical precision of the killing and the symbolic use of the dye suggested a ritual of marking the guilty, a public declaration that Hakan's crimes could no longer be hidden. 2 months later, a second body was discovered in a warehouse near the docks, belonging to a man notorious for his involvement in human trafficking. He had been killed with the same single shot to the forehead, and his right hand had been dipped into the same bright blue industrial dye. The Blue Hand murders became a whisper that terrified the criminal elite of the city, a sign that a phantom was hunting those the law could not touch. The investigation found that the killer was able to bypass high-level security systems that should have been impenetrable to a common criminal. The detective began to look toward the Special Operations Department, suspecting that the perpetrator might be a former member of the elite police units who had grown tired of seeing criminals walk free. He searched for anyone with the specific combination of tactical skill and access to the chemical dyes used in the local industry. In the third murder, which involved a corrupt official found dead in his private office, the killer left a small piece of parchment tucked under the victim's desk lamp. It was written in a beautiful, flowing hand using Ottoman Turkish, a script that few people in the modern city could still read fluently. When the detective had it translated, the message was a single, chilling sentence: the stain that cannot be washed by water or time. As the detective got closer to identifying a group of former officers who had disappeared from the official records, he received a phone call from a high-ranking authority in Ankara. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that the Blue Hand cases were being reclassified as internal security matters and were no longer under his jurisdiction. All the evidence, including the ceramic bowls and the blue dye samples, was seized by unmarked government vehicles within 24 hours. The official story released to the public was that the killings were part of a violent internal struggle between competing drug cartels in the Aegean region. The detective was reassigned to a quiet desk job in a different province, his notebooks and personal files confiscated under the threat of a treason charge. He realized then that the Blue Hand was not just a vigilante, but perhaps a tool of the deep state, used to clean up messes that had become too public. As of April 2026, the identity of the person or group behind the Blue Hand executions remains one of Turkey's most guarded secrets. The signature never appeared again after 1995, and the files are locked away in a high-security archive where they are likely to remain for another 50 years. The criminals of İzmir returned to their business, but they never forgot the year when the color blue meant a death sentence that no amount of money could stop. The blue dye has long since faded from the marble terrace of the villa, and the house has been sold to a family of wealthy expatriates who know nothing of its history. But among the older officers in the İzmir Police Department, the story is still told in low voices during the late-night shifts. They remember the year when someone decided that some stains were so deep they required a different kind of justice to be made visible to the world. While one man used a chemical stain to mark the guilty, another used iron to pin down the innocent in a basement thousands of miles away. We leave the Aegean coast for the dust-choked streets of Pakistan, where a colonial-era villa became a house of ritual that proved some shadows are deeper than any law. We are heading to Peshawar, where the human body was treated as a canvas for a nightmare of 100 nails. In the humid twilight of October 1996, the thick canopy of the jungle near Goma was a wall of deep green silence. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and the distant, low rumble of thunder that signaled the approaching monsoon. A small, white-painted mission school sat on a cleared ridge, its iron gates glowing faintly under the rising moon. From the outside, the compound looked like a fortress of peace in a region that was rapidly descending into the chaos of the First Congo War. Inside the main classroom, Jean-Paul, a 35-year-old teacher trained in Brussels, was tidying a stack of French grammars. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his leather shoes clicking softly against the polished concrete floor. To Jean-Paul, this school was more than just a collection of buildings. It was a sanctuary of reason, where 60 children and teachers worked to build a future that felt increasingly fragile. He took pride in the sharpness of his pencils and the perfect alignment of the wooden desks. He often looked out the window at the school's vegetable garden, where the students learned to cultivate cabbage and maize alongside their arithmetic. Jean-Paul believed that order was the only defense against the growing darkness beyond the school walls. He was a man who planned his lessons weeks in advance, finding comfort in the predictable structure of the Belgian curriculum. His life was defined by the ringing of the school bell and the bright, eager eyes of the 48 children who called him mate. Among his students was a 10-year-old boy named Mose, who was known for his habit of drawing intricate maps of the stars in the margins of his notebooks. Mose was the son of a local farmer, but within the school grounds, he was a scholar of the universe. He spent his afternoons sitting on the low stone wall of the courtyard, watching the clouds change shape over the volcanic peaks of the Virunga Mountains. To Mose, the school was a place where the world felt large and full of possibilities, rather than small and dangerous. The daily routine was the heartbeat of the compound, starting with a communal breakfast at 6 in the morning and ending with quiet study hours at sunset. The teachers, 12 in total, lived in a row of small brick houses behind the library, sharing meals and stories of their training in Europe. They were a tight-knit group, bound by a shared mission to provide stability in a landscape that was being torn apart by shifting alliances and moving armies. Every evening, they checked the shortwave radio to confirm their safety to the Red Cross in Goma. Jean-Paul enjoyed the final hour of the day when the children were finishing their assignments and the kitchen staff began preparing the evening meal of beans and rice. The sound of dozens of pages turning at once was a melody he never tired of hearing. He would walk between the rows of desks, placing a hand on a shoulder or correcting a spelling error with a gentle nod. In those moments, the war felt like 1,000 miles away, separated from them by a layer of books and the locked iron gates. He often thought about the letter he was writing to his sister in Kinshasa, describing the new solar-powered lamps the Belgian NGO had sent. Jean-Paul wanted her to know that they were not just surviving, but thriving in the middle of the bush. He believed that as long as the school kept its gates locked and its lamps lit, they were invisible to the violence that prowled the jungle. It was a deep, silent conviction that guided his every action, a belief that the intellect could shield the body from the physical world. The kitchen staff worked in a small outbuilding, the clatter of metal spoons against ceramic plates echoing through the open courtyard. They were preparing for 60 people, measuring out portions with the precision that the mission required. The smell of wood smoke and simmering spices filled the air, a domestic and grounding scent that anchored the school to the earth. Outside, the crickets began their nightly chorus, a rhythmic buzzing that usually meant the world was exactly as it should be. On the night of October 17th, the shortwave radio in Goma crackled with static, but no voice came through from the mission school. The Red Cross coordinator, a woman named Dr. Claire, checked her watch and noted the time as exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. She adjusted the frequency and tried again, calling the school's call sign into the empty air. There was no answer, only the steady, rhythmic hiss of the white noise that suggested the transmitter was still on. But the room was empty. Dr. Claire waited until the next morning, hoping the silence was just a technical glitch caused by the heavy humidity or a failing battery. She knew the mission school was high priority and well protected, with a security system that was better than most government buildings in the region. But as the hours passed without a check-in, a cold, heavy feeling began to settle in the pit of her stomach. She organized a small team of 4 scouts and a driver to make the 3-hour trek into the rural hills to investigate. The road to the school was a narrow ribbon of mud and deep ruts, bordered on both sides by ancient trees that seemed to lean over the vehicle. As they approached the ridge, they noticed that the jungle was unnaturally quiet, with no birds or monkeys calling from the canopy. The driver slowed down as the white walls of the school came into view through the mist. The compound looked perfectly normal from a distance, its buildings standing tall and undamaged against the backdrop of the volcanoes. If you stood in the center of that courtyard, the silence would feel like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. Doctor. Claire stepped out of the jeep and walked toward the main entrance. Her boots crunching on the gravel path, she reached out to push the iron gates, expecting them to be barred or damaged. But they were locked firmly from the inside with a heavy steel bolt. There were no signs of forced entry, no bullet holes in the plaster, and no evidence of a struggle near the perimeter. She looked through the bars and saw a single leather shoe lying in the middle of the courtyard, perfectly upright, as if someone had simply stepped out of it while walking. Claire called out Jean-Paul's name, her voice echoing off the brick walls and returning to her unanswered. She signaled for one of the scouts to climb over the wall and open the gate from the inside. The metallic clank of the bolt sliding back was the only sound in the afternoon air, a sharp and lonely noise that made her flinch. The team moved toward the main classroom building, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. When they pushed open the double wooden doors, they were met with a scene that defied the logic of war or abduction. 60 desks were set for a lesson, with open textbooks and notebooks lying on the surfaces. In the middle of the front board, a half-written sentence in white chalk ended abruptly in a long, downward streak, as if the writer had been pulled away mid-word. Jean-Paul's fountain pen lay on the floor, its blue ink having leaked into a small, dried pool on the concrete. Claire walked to the front of the room and touched the chalk dust on the ledge. It was still thick and undisturbed. She noticed that the solar lamps were still turned on, their pale light flickering weakly as the batteries struggled to hold a charge. The air inside the room was stagnant and smelled faintly of old paper and the lingering scent of wood smoke from the kitchen. They moved to the dining hall, where the evening meal was still set out on the long wooden tables. There were 60 plates, each filled with a portion of beans and rice that had long since turned cold and hard. Spoons were resting on the edges of bowls, and half-filled cups of water sat untouched. It looked as if 60 people had sat down for dinner and then evaporated into the air before they could take their first bite. There were no overturned chairs and no spilled drinks. In the teachers' quarters, they found the beds neatly made and personal belongings still in place. Jean-Paul's half-finished letter to his sister sat on his small desk, the ink dry and the sentiments of hope frozen in time. Not a single suitcase had been packed, and not a single emergency kit had been taken. The shortwave radio in the office was still switched to the on position, its red light glowing like a tiny, accusing eye in the dim corner of the room. The scouts searched the perimeter of the school, looking for any sign of a mass movement into the surrounding jungle. They found no footprints in the mud, no broken branches, and no trails of flattened grass that would indicate 60 people being led away at gunpoint. It was as if the entire population of the school had simply ceased to occupy the physical world. The lack of information was more terrifying than any evidence of a massacre could have been. I think the true horror isn't the violence we see, but the absence of the people we expect to find. Claire stood in the middle of the empty courtyard, realizing that 60 human beings had vanished from a locked fortress without making a single sound. She spoke to a local villager who lived 2 miles down the ridge, an elderly man who claimed he had been outside all night. He insisted that he heard nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees, a constant, low moaning that never changed. The investigation turned toward a series of deep volcanic caves that honeycombed the earth beneath the ridge. Some suggested that a rebel group had forced the teachers and children into the dark tunnels to hide them or dispose of them without a trace. The search team spent days lowering themselves into the black, sulfurous depths, their flashlights cutting through the ancient dampness. They found old bones and volcanic glass, but not a single piece of clothing or a single footprint from the missing 60. Another theory involved a ghost transport, a clandestine operation where unmarked trucks had arrived at the gate and loaded the entire school for transport across the border into Rwanda. But the roads were monitored by various factions, and no one reported seeing a convoy of 60 people moving through the war zone. The locked gates from the inside remained the ultimate paradox, suggesting that whatever happened occurred while everyone was still safely tucked behind their own defenses. The local authorities in Goma eventually stopped the search as the First Congo War intensified and the front lines shifted toward the school. The Belgian NGO withdrew its support, and the Red Cross was forced to abandon the site due to the proximity of the AFDL rebels. The files were marked as unresolved mass disappearance and buried in the archives of international agencies. Another casualty of a region where the truth is often the first thing to be lost in the tall grass. The chalkboard lesson remained frozen for months, the white chalk slowly fading as the humidity of the jungle crept back into the rooms. The iron gates eventually rusted shut, and the white walls were covered by a thick layer of creeping vines and moss. The story of the School of Silence became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the night the jungle opened its mouth and swallowed 60 souls without leaving a bone behind. The chalkboard was a physical record of a moment that never finished. As of April 2026, the mission school near Goma has been almost entirely reclaimed by the Democratic Republic of the Congo's dense wilderness. The roof of the main classroom has collapsed under the weight of the rain, and the vegetable gardens are now home to wild pigs and thick brush. No remains have ever been found, and not a single survivor has ever stepped out of the trees to tell the story. The disappearance remains one of the most haunting cold cases of the 1990s, a Mary Celeste of the African bush that defies every forensic and logical explanation. The 60 names are still listed on the Red Cross Missing Persons Registry. 60 lives that ended mid-sentence on a Tuesday evening in October. The silence of the school grounds is now permanent, a heavy, velvet quiet that seems to push away anyone who tries to enter the ridge. The jungle does not give back what it has taken, and it does not offer explanations for the things it hides. Jean-Paul and his students are part of the earth now, their dreams and their maps of the stars buried under 30 years of tropical growth. When the wind blows over the ridge today, it still carries that low, moaning sound that the old villager described, a sound that suggests some things are better left in the shadows. The oppressive silence of a school in the Congo is a world away from the misty, volcanic forests of Japan. We are moving from a mystery of mass disappearance to a mystery of an impossible death high above the ground. We are heading to Aokigahara, where a man's own marking ribbon became a trap that defied the laws of gravity and the logic of fear. This is the story of the Sea of Trees and a man who climbed toward a terror he could not escape. In the autumn of 1995, a search party in the Aokigahara forest stopped at the base of a massive hemlock tree. They had been following a trail of bright yellow plastic ribbon for 3 hours, expecting to find a lost hiker at the end of it. Instead, the ribbon led their eyes upward, into the dark, suffocating canopy where something impossible was waiting for them. Kenji Kasahara, 42, stood at the edge of the sea of trees and checked the tension of his heavy backpack. He was a man of extreme discipline, a semi-professional rock climber and competitive orienteer who viewed the wilderness as a puzzle to be solved. He did not believe in the urban legends of spirits or magnetic anomalies that supposedly made people vanish in these woods. On this Tuesday morning, He tied the end of a roll of yellow plastic ribbon to a sturdy cypress root. He was scouting a new route through the volcanic cavern zones, a place where the jagged ground made every step a calculated risk. He moved with a slow, mechanical precision, unspooling the ribbon every 10 paces to ensure he would have a clear path back to his vehicle. The air inside Aokigahara was stagnant and smelled of damp moss and ancient, rotting wood. The forest was famous for its silence, as the porous volcanic rock absorbed sound like a thick sponge. Kenji enjoyed this isolation, finding that the heavy quiet helped him focus on the topographical maps he carried in a waterproof sleeve. He was a creature of logic and physical facts. By noon, he had penetrated 2 kilometers into the densest part of the forest, where the sunlight only reached the ground in thin, needle-like beams. He sat on a mossy stone and took a long drink of water, noting his coordinates in a small leather journal. Everything was proceeding exactly according to his plan, and he felt the deep satisfaction of a professional master of his environment. He often told his students that the most dangerous thing in the woods was not a predator, but a wandering mind. A compass is only as good as the ground it stands on. To Kenji, survival was a matter of mathematics and gear maintenance. He checked the needle of his expensive brass compass, watching it settle into a steady, reliable north despite the iron-rich soil beneath his boots. His life winning Tokyo was defined by the same level of order and predictability. He worked as an architectural surveyor, a job that required him to measure the world in millimeters. He had a wife and 2 daughters who expected him home by 7 o'clock for dinner. He was the anchor of his family, a man who never left a task unfinished or a knot untied. As he began the second half of his scout, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the hemlock grove. The wind, which had been a faint whisper through the upper branches, suddenly died away completely. The silence became even heavier, a velvet pressure that seemed to push against his eardrums. He stopped walking and listened, his hand resting on the hilt of his climbing knife. He turned his head slowly, scanning the shadows between the twisted trunks for any sign of movement. There were no animals in this part of the forest, a fact that usually brought him peace, but now felt like a missing piece of a larger machine. He told himself it was just the altitude affecting his senses, yet he found himself tightening the straps of his pack instinctively. There are no branches here for me to hold. The thought flashed through his mind as he looked at the tall, smooth trunks surrounding him. He realized that if he fell here, there would be nothing to stop his descent into the jagged cracks of the volcanic floor. He shook his head to clear the irrational fear and reached for the next section of yellow ribbon. The unusual event began when he reached for the ribbon and found it was no longer trailing behind him on the ground. Instead, the yellow plastic line was pulled taut, leading upward at a 45-degree angle toward the lower branches of a massive hemlock. He tugged on the ribbon, expecting it to be snagged on a twig, but the line felt as solid as a steel cable. He stepped closer to the tree, trying to understand how the ribbon had bypassed the laws of gravity. As he watched, the yellow line began to move, unspooling from the roll at his belt with a high-pitched, rhythmic zipping sound. It was being pulled upward into the dark canopy by a force that was steady, powerful, and entirely silent. He reached for his knife to cut the link. He felt the sudden, violent upward pull, not as a force of nature, but as a deliberate invitation. Before his blade could touch the plastic, his feet were jerked off the mossy ground. He didn't have time to scream as he was hoisted into the air, the yellow ribbon unspooling rapidly and wrapping around his ankles with the speed of a professional weaver. He was no longer the navigator. 3 days later, a search party consisting of 5 experienced rangers and 2 local police officers discovered the start of the yellow trail. They followed it with growing confusion, noting that the ribbon was not tied to the trees in the usual manner. In several places, it was looped around trunks and complex, braided patterns that looked more like decorative lace than a hiker's marker. The rangers stopped at the base of the hemlock tree when the yellow ribbon finally ended. They looked at the forest floor, and found Kenji's expensive brass compass lying in the center of a small clearing. The heavy metal casing had been shattered as if struck by a sledgehammer, and the needle was bent into a perfect 90-degree angle, pointing directly toward the sky. One of the rangers looked up and dropped his flashlight in shock. Suspended 15 meters above them was a massive, tangled web of yellow plastic ribbon. It was woven between the upper branches of the hemlock in a geometric pattern that was too precise to be accidental. In the center of this web, tangled like a fly in a silk trap, was the body of Kenji Kasahara. The team spent the next 4 hours using climbing gear and chainsaws to reach the body. They found that Kenji had not been hanged by the neck. Rather, he was held in place by dozens of loops of ribbon that were tightly wound around his chest, arms, and ankles. The plastic was so tight that it had cut through his heavy hiking jacket and into his skin. The investigation was led by Detective Sato, a man who had seen hundreds of suicides in Aokigahara over his 20-year career. But he had never seen anything that defied the physical logic of the forest like this. He noted that there were no broken branches below the body, which meant Kenji had not climbed the tree and fallen into the ribbon. He had been placed there. Forensic technicians examined the knots in the yellow plastic and found them to be mathematically perfect. Each loop was tied with a tension that was consistent throughout the entire structure, far beyond what a panicked or dying man could achieve. The geometry of the web was described by a university professor as a three-dimensional representation of a complex fractal pattern. The search party found Kenji's climbing knife still in its sheath, the safety strap untouched. This was a man who knew how to free himself from a rope in seconds. Yet he had made no attempt to use his tools. His hands were found palm up, his fingers curved as if he were still trying to grasp something that was no longer there when the end finally came. The most baffling detail was the condition of Kenji's ankles. When the boots were removed during the autopsy, the medical examiner found deep, circular bruising that went all the way to the bone. The marks were not caused by the plastic ribbon, but by something much wider and more powerful, as if he had been gripped by massive, cold hands and pulled upward into the dark. A local ranger named Hiroshi, who had worked the Fuji district since 1970, refused to enter the grove after the body was removed. He whispered to the detectives that they were dealing with the spider of the sea, a forest entity that was said to trap travelers who relied too much on their tools and not enough on their respect for the ancient trees. Detective Sato dismissed the local superstitions and focused on the mechanical evidence. He tried to recreate the spider web using the same type of yellow ribbon and a team of professional riggers. After 6 hours of work, the riggers were unable to achieve even half of the complexity found at the crime scene. The tension required to hold a grown man that high was impossible. The autopsy results provided the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Kenji Kasahara had not died from the constriction of the ribbon or from a fall. He had died from a massive, sudden heart attack induced by extreme terror. His adrenaline levels were the highest the medical examiner had ever recorded, suggesting he was alive and fully conscious while being woven into the canopy. The police eventually ruled the death as an accidental entanglement, a verdict that pleased the local tourism board but satisfied no one else. They claimed that Kenji must have tripped, caught his foot in the ribbon, and somehow launched himself into the tree during a freak windstorm. It was a clinical explanation that ignored every physical fact found by the search party. His family in Tokyo received his personal belongings in a small cardboard box, including the shattered compass and the empty roll of yellow ribbon. His wife, a woman of quiet strength, noted that Kenji would never have allowed his gear to break like that. She believed her husband had encountered something in the woods that his logical mind could not process, a force that broke his heart. The case was officially closed in late 1996, but it remained a legendary cold case among the Aokigahara Rangers. They called it the Spider Case, a warning to any hiker who thought they could master the forest with a roll of plastic and a map. The grove where the hemlock stood was eventually marked as a restricted zone, off limits to all casual travelers. I have stood at the edge of that forest, and the silence there is not empty, it is waiting. The local authorities stopped keeping records of the specific tree after a series of strange sightings in the late 90s, where hikers reported seeing yellow ribbons appearing in the upper branches overnight. The forest has a way of repeating the patterns it likes, regardless of the law. As of April 2026, the legend of Kenji Kasahara is still discussed on Japanese paranormal forums and among the older residents of the Yamanashi prefecture. In 2025, a group of urban explorers attempted to find the hemlock tree using GPS coordinates from the original police file. They found the clearing, but the tree itself had been split by lightning. The explorers reported that the charred remains of the hemlock were still draped in thin, weathered strips of yellow plastic that had turned a ghostly white over the decades. They didn't stay long, as one of their members felt a sudden, sharp tug on his backpack strap that nearly pulled him off his feet. They left their equipment behind and ran for the trailhead. The spider case remains a chilling example of how the wilderness can turn a man's own defenses into a lethal trap. Kenji Kasahara entered the woods with a plan to mark his path, but he ended up becoming a permanent part of the landscape he tried to conquer. The yellow ribbon was supposed to lead him home, but it only led him into the dark. Sometimes, the things we use to keep ourselves safe are the very things that make us vulnerable. Aokigahara does not care about your experience or your expensive climbing gear. It only cares about the moment you stop looking at the ground and start looking at the shadows above. Be careful what you tie your life to when you step into the trees. From the vertical terror of a Japanese forest, we move to the urban parks of Brazil, where a different kind of predator used a different kind of tool to reflect his victim's final moments. We are leaving the trees for the city of Curitiba, where a killer left a small, glass vanity in the hands of the dead. This is the story of the mirror killer and the reflection of a nightmare. In the late evening of November 1995, a cold wind from the south swept through the wide, tree-lined streets of Curitiba. The city was known for its orderly parks and European architecture, a place that felt more like a quiet corner of Germany than a bustling Brazilian capital. Lucia, a 32-year-old librarian, buttoned her wool coat as she stepped out of the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral, feeling the damp chill on her skin. The air smelled of pine needles and old stone, a scent that always signaled the arrival of a Curitiba winter. Lucia adjusted her scarf, feeling the familiar, steady weight of her leather prayer book in her right hand. She began her walk toward the bus stop, her footsteps echoing sharply against the wet pavement of the empty plaza. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, rhythmic shadows that stretched and contracted as she moved through the dark. Lucia had lived in the same apartment for 10 years. A small, bright space filled with stacks of books and dried flowers. Her life was a series of quiet, predictable cycles, centered around her work at the university library and her weekly attendance at the evening mass. She was a woman who found comfort in the order of the Dewey Decimal System and the ancient, unchanging words of the liturgy. Her co-workers knew her as a meticulous soul who never left a book out of place. Every Tuesday night, she followed the same path through the park. Past the statues of poets and the empty benches of the plaza, she enjoyed the solitude of the late walk, finding that the silence of the city helped her process the noise of the day. Lucia was not a person who feared the dark, as she had always believed that Curitiba was a city that looked after its own. She walked with a steady, confident pace, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the bus terminal. At the library, Lucia spent her hours repairing old manuscripts with a fine brush and a steady hand. She loved the feel of the ancient paper and the way the ink seemed to hold the thoughts of people who had been dead for centuries. To her, a library was a fortress of memory, a place where nothing was ever truly lost if you knew where to look. She treated every volume with a reverence that bordered on the religious, seeing herself as a guardian of the city's collective mind. Her family lived in a small town 3 hours to the north, and she wrote to them every Sunday without fail. Her letters were filled with descriptions of the changing seasons and the new exhibits at the botanical garden. She was the eldest of three sisters, the one who had always been the most responsible and the most independent. Lucia's dreams were modest, involving a future where she might eventually manage her own department and perhaps travel to the libraries of Europe. On this specific Tuesday, the church service had lasted longer than usual due to a special prayer for the upcoming Advent. The cathedral had been filled with the scent of beeswax and heavy incense, a fragrance that lingered in Lucia's hair long after she stepped into the night. She felt a deep, resonant sense of peace as she crossed the street, her mind still humming with the final notes of the organ. The city felt soft and muffled, as if the fog was absorbing the rough edges of reality. She noticed a man standing near the edge of the park, his figure obscured by a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was leaning against a lamppost, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. Watching the few pedestrians who remained on the street, Lucia didn't think much of it, as Curitiba was full of people waiting for buses or enjoying the late-night air. She kept her eyes on the path, her boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves that lined the gravel walkway. As she entered the deeper section of the park, the sound of the traffic began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water from the pine branches. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the bases of the trees in slow, ghostly patterns. Lucia felt the first hint of a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sudden, sharp tightening in the muscles of her neck. She didn't look back, but she increased her pace, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. The park was a labyrinth of shadowed corners and stone bridges, a place she had navigated hundreds of times before. But tonight, the familiar geometry of the trees seemed to shift, the branches reaching out like thin, black fingers in the mist. She could hear the sound of another set of footsteps behind her, moving at the exact same tempo as her own. When she stopped to adjust her scarf, the sound behind her stopped as well, leaving the air thick with an expectant silence. She reached the center of the grove, where a massive oak tree stood as a sentinel over the path. Lucia felt a sudden, cold pressure against her throat, a wire so thin and sharp that it felt like a line of ice cutting into her skin. She tried to reach up, her fingers clawing at the air, but her movements were restricted by a force that was steady and absolute. The world began to tilt, the lights of the distant plaza spinning into a blur of white and gray as the air left her lungs. The next morning, a city worker arriving to clear the trash cans found Lucia sitting upright against the base of the oak tree. She looked as if she were simply taking a rest, her coat buttoned and her prayer book resting neatly in her lap. But as the worker stepped closer, he saw a glint of light reflecting from her right hand. A small, round vanity mirror had been glued firmly to her palm, positioned so that her sightless eyes were staring directly into her own reflection. A mirror is a cruel witness to the end. The police arrived within the hour, led by a detective named Marcos, who had spent 15 years investigating the darker corners of Curitiba. He knelt in the damp grass, looking at the way the mirror caught the morning sun. It was a cheap, plastic-rimmed object, the kind sold in any pharmacy in the city. But the way it was placed showed a level of theatrical intent that made the detective's skin crawl with a new kind of dread. There was no sign of a struggle and no evidence of a robbery. As Lucia's purse and jewelry remained untouched, the cause of death was a single, clean mark around her neck, caused by a high-tension wire that had been pulled with professional precision. Detective Marcos noted that the killer had not tried to hide the body. Instead, he had displayed it in one of the most high-traffic areas of the park. It was a presentation designed to be found, a message written in the language of the dead. The investigation moved into the nearby church, as witnesses confirmed that Lucia had been seen leaving the evening mass just after 9 o'clock. The detectives interviewed the priest and the regular parishioners, looking for anyone who might have followed her or shown an unusual interest in her routine. They found nothing but stories of her kindness and her quiet life. The city of Curitiba began to feel like a smaller, more dangerous place as the news of the mirror killer began to leak into the local papers. Forensic science in Brazil in 1995 was a struggle against limited budgets and aging equipment. There were no DNA databases to search and no high-speed cameras to track a suspect through the streets. Marcos had to rely on old-fashioned police work, walking the same paths the victims took and looking for any tiny detail that had been overlooked. He spent his nights in the park, sitting on the same benches where the victims might have rested, trying to see the world through the killer's eyes. 2 more women were found in the following weeks, both discovered in city parks. Both posed against trees with mirrors in their hands. One was a teacher and the other was a nurse, both of whom had been targeted after leaving evening church services. The pattern was becoming a terrifyingly clear map of the killer's obsession. He was a predator who hunted in the sacred spaces of the city, turning the comfort of faith into a prelude for a silent, reflected execution. I think we all look for our own faces in the shadows before we realize they are gone. The third victim, a 25-year-old named Beatriz, had been found with a larger mirror, one that showed not just her face, but the deep, dark line across her throat. The staging was becoming more elaborate, the killer spending more time with the bodies after they were dead. He was not just a murderer, he was a director, and the parks of Curitiba were his private, open-air stage. Detective Marcos realized that the mirrors were all of a specific brand, a line of inexpensive vanity products sold only in the industrial district to the south. He assigned a team to visit every pharmacy and small shop in the area, showing a sketch of a man in a long coat. They found a clerk who remembered a man with very clean hands and a soft voice who had purchased a dozen of the mirrors in a single transaction. The man had paid in cash and hadn't left a name. The sketch was too generic to lead to an immediate arrest, showing a face that could have belonged to any professional in the city. Marcos began to suspect that the killer was someone who held a position of trust, someone who could move through the parks and the churches without drawing any suspicion. He looked at the medical records of local surgeons and the employment files of the police department. He felt as if he were chasing a reflection, something that was always visible but impossible to grasp. The pressure from the public was reaching a breaking point, with protests forming outside the police headquarters demanding justice. The parks, once the pride of the city, were empty after sunset. The playgrounds haunted only by the wind and the fog. Every man in a long coat was seen as a potential monster, and the churches began to hire private security to escort women to their cars. Curitiba was a city under siege by a ghost who used glass to tell his story. Then, just as suddenly as the murders had begun, they stopped. The fourth victim had been found in June of 1996, a young woman who worked at the city's administrative building. After her death, the mirror killer vanished from the streets, leaving no more bodies and no more reflections for the police to find. Detective Marcos kept the files on his desk for years, waiting for a new lead or a matching crime to appear in another city. But the trail went cold. The psychological profile suggested a killer who had achieved a specific goal or who had been interrupted by an external force. Some believed he had been incarcerated for a different crime, while others thought he might have been a member of the elite who fled the country. There was a theory that the killer was a man who worked within the legal system itself, someone who knew exactly how to stop before the net closed around him. The silence was as frustrating as the crimes themselves. As of April 2026, the case of the mirror killer of Curitiba remains officially unsolved. In late 2025, a cold case unit began using new forensic genealogy technology to re-examine the tiny samples of glue and skin cells found on the mirrors. They are hoping to find a match in the growing global DNA databases that did not exist 30 years ago. The files have been digitized, but the photographs of the victims still carry the same haunting, reflected stare. The parks are once again full of families and joggers. The oak trees standing tall over the gravel paths. Most of the people walking there today are too young to remember the year of the mirrors, and the stone benches no longer feel like a threat. But for the families of the four women, the city is still a place of unanswered questions and frozen moments. They still look at their own reflections and wonder if the man with the clean hands is still out there, watching. The killer's identity is a secret held by the soil and the old pine trees of Paraná. The mirrors were supposed to make the victims reflect on their own deaths, but they ended up reflecting the failures of a system that could not catch a ghost. Detective Marcos is retired now, but he still visits the cathedral every Tuesday night. He sits in the back row, watching the doors, his eyes scanning the long coats of the men who step out into the cold, damp night. Sometimes a story does not have an ending, only a long, quiet pause that stretches across the decades. The mirror killer remains a shadow in the history of Brazil, a reminder that the most orderly cities can hide the most disordered minds. The glass in the victim's hands has been locked away in evidence rooms, but the image of those stage scenes still lingers in the minds of those who saw them. Truth is often just a reflection that we are not yet ready to see. The polished glass of a killer in Brazil reflects a darkness that is mirrored in the ancient, ritualistic iron of a house in Pakistan. We are moving from the urban parks of Curitiba to the dust-heavy air of Peshawar, where a different kind of obsession left a permanent mark on the bones of the forgotten. We are heading to the House of 100 Nails, where the silence of the basement tells a story of a faith that turned into a nightmare. In the early months of 1996, the ancient city of Peshawar was a labyrinth of dust-heavy air and the constant, rhythmic sound of copper being hammered in the narrow alleys. The sun was a pale, heat-bleached disk that seemed to hang motionless over the colonial-era villas. Arshad, a 30-year-old day laborer from the northern mountains, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a tattered cloth. He had come to the city looking for a way to support his mother, but he found only the crushing weight of poverty and a world that did not know his name. His life was a series of long days spent lifting heavy bricks under a sky that offered no shade and no mercy. He slept on a thin piece of cardboard in a crowded alleyway, his only possessions being a small prayer mat and a photograph of his village. Arshad was a man of quiet faith, believing that his struggle was a test that would eventually lead him to a better place. He missed the scent of the pine forests and the cool, clean water of the high ridges, far away from the stagnant smell of the city's open drains. Every evening, he sat outside a small tea stall, sipping lukewarm liquid from a cracked plastic cup and listening to the whispers of the other transients. They talked about a man they called the healer, a wealthy individual who lived in a large, walled villa on the outskirts of the city. The healer was said to be a man of immense piety who provided shelter and spiritual cleansing for those who had lost their way. To a man like Arshad, who had nothing but his hunger and his prayers, the villa sounded like a sanctuary in the middle of a desert. Arshad's dreams were simple and focused on the survival of his family back in the mountains. He wanted to save enough money to buy a new goat for his mother and perhaps a warm shawl for the upcoming winter. He moved through the crowded streets with a humble, lowered gaze, avoiding the eyes of the city's elite who drove by in polished cars. He felt like a ghost in his own life, a person who occupied space but left no mark on the world around him. He decided that the next time the healer's carriage passed by, he would ask for help. The healer was a figure of great mystery and respect, often seen wearing a deep green turban and robes that smelled of expensive sandalwood and musk. He did not speak much, but his presence carried a weight that made people move aside when he walked through the marketplace. He maintained a reputation for kindness, often handing out small coins to the beggars who lined the entrance to the Friday prayers. His villa was a fortress of mahogany and stone, hidden behind a gate that remained locked to the prying eyes of the local authorities. A few miles away, in the heart of the blacksmith's district. A man named Farouk was working at his glowing forge. He was a master of his craft, known for his ability to shape iron into delicate latticework or heavy gate hinges. One afternoon, a servant from the villa arrived with a specific order that made Farouk stop his hammer in midair. The servant requested 100 hand-forged iron nails, each exactly 6 inches long, with heads that were perfectly flat and edges that were sharpened to a needlepoint. The servant insisted that the nails be pure, meaning they were to be cooled in well water rather than oil, and they were not to be blessed by any local imam. Farouk found the request odd, but the pay was 3 times his usual rate, and he did not ask questions in a city where silence was often the price of safety. He spent 3 days in the intense heat of his shop, his muscles aching as he hammered the glowing metal into the precise shapes required by the master of the villa. As the nails were being finished, the neighbors near the colonial villa began to notice a change in the atmosphere of the street. It started with a low, rhythmic tapping sound that echoed from the basement of the house, usually beginning after the final prayers of the night. It was a steady, metallic noise that sounded like a slow-moving clock. Along with the sound came a new scent that the wind carried through the open windows of the nearby homes, a heavy, sweet smell of decay that made the local shopkeepers gag. The smell became a physical presence in the neighborhood, a thick and cloying vapor that seemed to cling to the walls and the laundry hanging on the lines. People began to walk on the other side of the street, their hands covering their faces as they hurried past the villa's high walls. Complaints were made to the local police, but the healer's influence was such that the officers were told to ignore the nuisance of a wealthy man's private spiritual practices. The tapping sound continued, night after night, without interruption. Officer Khan was a young investigator who had not yet learned the art of looking the other way when a situation felt wrong. He had grown up in the same district and felt a deep responsibility to the people who lived in the shadow of the villa. He began to keep a private log of the strange occurrences, noting the times the tapping started and the frequency of the deliveries to the back gate. He noticed that several men he had seen at the local tea stall, including the quiet laborer Arshad, had not been seen for weeks. One Tuesday morning, the wind shifted with a sudden, violent intensity, blowing the scent from the villa directly into the open window of the police substation. It was no longer a nuisance. It was the undeniable smell of a mass grave that had been opened to the sun. Officer Khan stood up, his face pale, and grabbed his service pistol from the locked cabinet. He did not wait for a warrant or permission from his superiors, knowing that the time for protocol had been buried under the weight of the stench. Khan led a team of 4 officers to the mahogany gates of the villa, their boots thumping against the dusty pavement. They didn't knock. They used a heavy iron bar to pry the lock and force their way into the courtyard. The air inside the walls was even thicker, a stagnant soup of heat and rot that made several of the men vomit instantly. The house was silent, the windows shuttered and the doors barred from the inside. Khan kicked in the front entrance, his flashlight cutting through the gloom of the main hall. The interior of the villa was a scene of clinical, terrifying order. The walls were covered in charcoal inscriptions that mixed regional occult symbols with complex geometric patterns. There were circles within circles, drawn with a steady hand that showed no signs of hesitation. The furniture had been pushed to the edges of the rooms, leaving the center of the floors open and bare. Khan followed the smell toward the back of the house, where a set of stone stairs led down into a darkness that felt like a physical barrier. The basement was a long, low-ceilinged room with walls of unpainted brick and a floor of packed earth. As Khan's light swept across the space, he saw the first body. It was not lying in a pile, but was pinned to the floor in a specific, upright position. A man was held in place by 4 iron nails, one through each shoulder and one through each hip, driven deep into the wooden beams that lay beneath the dirt. The victim was staring at the ceiling, his mouth open in a silent, frozen cry. Khan moved further into the room, his light revealing more figures in the shadows. There were 12 men in total, all transients who had vanished from the city streets over the last several months. Each body had been treated with a sickening level of anatomical precision. The long iron nails had been driven through the joints and the center of the skulls, avoiding the major arteries to ensure that the transition from life to death was as slow and as conscious as possible. I hoped they were at least unconscious before the final blow was struck. But the deep gouges in the wooden beams told a different story of struggle. Khan realized that the healer had not been looking for souls to save, but for bodies to use as a canvas for his nightmare. The nails were not just fasteners, they were the central elements of a ritual that required the victims to be immobile and alive, while the charcoal symbols were drawn around them. The healer was gone, his private quarters upstairs as clean and empty as if he had never lived there. The only thing he had left behind was a small iron hammer sitting on the bedside table, its surface wiped free of any fingerprints or biological matter. There were no journals, no maps, and no indication of where he might have fled. He had dissolved into the city of Peshawar, leaving behind a basement full of iron and bone that would haunt the officers for the rest of their lives. Farouk the blacksmith was found dead in a hit-and-run accident just 2 days after he had identified the servant who purchased the nails. No witnesses came forward in the tribal district, and the vehicle involved was never recovered by the police. It was a professional silencing that effectively cut off the only lead the investigators had. The fear of the healer's influence, and the rumors of his connections to powerful jinn, made everyone in the neighborhood go silent about what they had seen. Faith can be a sanctuary for the weary, but in the hands of a predator, it becomes a cage forged in iron. The investigation into the Peshawar ritual was abruptly halted by a higher authority within the provincial government, citing a lack of evidence and the need to maintain social stability in a sensitive region. The names of the 12 victims were never added to an official report, as they were men with no families and no identities in the eyes of the law. The case was officially closed in late 1997, and the files were stored in a damp basement in the police headquarters, where they were forgotten by almost everyone. The House of 100 Nails became a local legend, a dark story told in the tea stalls to warn travelers about the dangers of accepting help from strangers in the city. The charcoal symbols on the walls remained for years, as no local laborer was willing to enter the house to paint over them. As of April 2026, the site of the colonial villa is a vacant, scorched square of earth. In 2010, during a period of civil unrest, a mob of local residents armed with torches burned the house to the ground to purify the neighborhood of the evil that had happened there. The heat was so intense that the stone walls collapsed, and the iron nails in the basement were likely melted down or buried deep under the charred remains of the mahogany. The lot remains empty today, as no one in Peshawar will buy the land or build a new home on the site where the healer practiced his ritual. The dust of the city still blows across the scorched earth, and neighbors claim that on humid nights, the faint, rhythmic sound of tapping can still be heard coming from the ground. It is a place that the city has tried to erase, but the memory of the iron and the charcoal is a stain that the wind cannot wash away. The victims, including the quiet laborer Arshad, were eventually buried in an unmarked communal grave on the outskirts of the city. Their dreams of sending money home or buying a new goat died in the darkness of that basement, lost to a ritual that no one could explain and no one was allowed to solve. The case remains one of Pakistan's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries, a reminder of the predators who hide behind the mask of piety and the silence of the law. Sometimes the most terrifying things are not the monsters we imagine in the dark, but the men who walk among us in broad daylight wearing the robes of a saint. The healer of Peshawar may still be out there, his hammer and his charcoal ready for a new canvas in a different city. In a world of 1 billion souls, it is easy for a man to vanish, especially when he knows exactly how to make others vanish with him. From the dust-choked rituals of a Pakistani basement, we move to the freezing silence of the Russian hinterlands. We are leaving the heat for a road where the environment itself was used to create a different kind of tomb. We are heading to the Ural highway near Perm, where the snow was not just a winter covering, but a tool for a killer who sculpted his crimes out of ice and bone. This is the story of the Snowman of the highway. In the middle of a February night in 1996, the wind across the Ural highway felt like a razor blade against the skin. Yuri, a 45-year-old truck driver, climbed out of his heavy cab and pulled his thick fur hat over his ears. He grabbed a metal shovel from the back of his trailer and began to clear a massive drift of snow that had piled up against the tires. Every breath he took felt like swallowing needles of ice, but the rhythmic sound of metal hitting the frozen ground was the only thing keeping him awake. Yuri had spent 20 years driving the route between Perm and Yekaterinburg, a stretch of road that was famous for swallowing men and machines alike. His truck was more than just a vehicle. It was a small, mobile island of warmth in a sea of white that stretched for thousands of miles in every direction. He kept a faded photograph of his wife and 2 young daughters taped to the dashboard, right next to a small wooden icon of St. Christopher. To Yuri, the long-haul life was a trade that provided for his family during the difficult years of the mid-90s. The smell of diesel fumes mixed with the sharp, clean scent of 1,000 miles of untouched snow as Yuri worked. He moved with a steady pace, his heavy boots sinking into the powder with a satisfying crunch. The highway was empty, the only light coming from the pale moon and the orange glow of his idling headlights. He felt a deep sense of solitude that was common for truckers in the Russian hinterlands, where the distance between towns was measured in days rather than hours. "I just want to be home by Friday," he thought to himself. Long-haul driving in Russia during this era required a specific kind of mental toughness and mechanical knowledge. Yuri knew every rattle and hum of his engine, and he carried a collection of spare parts that he had bartered for in the markets of Perm. The roads were often neglected, and a breakdown in the middle of a Siberian winter could easily become a death sentence if a driver was not prepared. He lived by a strict set of rules, including never stopping for strangers and always keeping his fuel tanks at least half full, no matter the cost. His fellow drivers were a tight-knit community, sharing information about road conditions and corrupt police checkpoints over crackling shortwave radios. They looked out for one another, knowing that the environment was their primary enemy. Yuri often stopped at a specific rest area near the halfway point, a place where the tea was always hot and the stories were always long. It was a rare sanctuary where the men could shed their heavy coats and remember that they were part of a world beyond the endless white horizon of the Ural Mountains. He often imagined the moment he would pull into his driveway, the way the yellow light from the kitchen window would spill across the snow. He could almost taste the hot borscht his wife would have waiting for him, the steam rising from the bowl in thick, fragrant clouds. These mental images were his fuel, the things that kept his eyes open when the hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers threatened to lull him into a dangerous sleep. To Yuri, every mile traveled was a victory for his family and a step closer to the warmth of his home. Nature is indifferent, but man-made cold has a specific kind of malice. As Yuri finished clearing the snow from his tires, he noticed something unusual near the edge of the rest area parking lot. About 20 yards away, a large, upright mound of snow stood perfectly still against the dark backdrop of the pine forest. It was about 6 feet tall and had a smooth, glass-like finish that reflected the light from his truck. It didn't look like a natural drift or the messy piles left behind by a snowplow. It was too deliberate and too symmetrical. He paused with his shovel in hand, watching the mound for any sign of movement. The wind whirled around it, but the structure remained as solid as a block of granite. Yuri felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, a sensation he usually only felt when he was being watched by a predator in the woods. He told himself it was likely just a prank by some local teenagers or a bit of strange frozen slush. But the way the moonlight hit the surface made it look like polished marble. It was an object that did not belong in this wilderness. Curiosity eventually overrode his caution, and Yuri began to walk toward the mound. His shovel held out like a defensive weapon. As he got closer, he saw that the snow was not just piled up, but seemed to have been melted and refrozen into a solid shell of ice. The surface was incredibly smooth, with no fingerprints or tool marks visible in the dim light. He reached out a gloved hand and tapped the side of the mound, hearing a dull, heavy thud that suggested something solid was encased inside the frozen layers. It felt far too dense to be just snow. He moved his flashlight over the top of the structure, and the beam caught a flash of something dark and irregular protruding from the very peak. It looked like a piece of weathered wood, or perhaps a discarded glove. Yuri leaned in, his breath fogging the air between him and the mound, and realized with a jolt of horror that he was looking at a human hand. The fingers were curled into a rigid claw, the skin a pale, frozen blue that matched the color of the surrounding ice. The hand was reaching upward, as if trying to break through the surface. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and Yuri stumbled back, his boots slipping on the slick pavement, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it felt like it might burst. He didn't look back at the mound as he climbed into the cab and slammed the door, locking it with trembling fingers. He threw the truck into gear and accelerated away from the rest area, his tires spinning for a second before catching the road. He didn't stop until he reached a police outpost 20 miles down the highway. When the local authorities arrived at the rest area, they found the mound exactly as Yuri had described. Using portable heaters and small picks, the officers began the grim task of melting away the outer shell of ice. As the layers vanished, the figure of a man was revealed, standing perfectly upright in the center of the mound. He was wearing a heavy winter jacket and boots, his eyes wide open and staring into the distance. It was a missing driver named Victor, who had disappeared from a nearby truck stop 3 days earlier. There was no blood. The medical examiner determined that Victor had been killed by a massive blow to the back of the head with a heavy, blunt object, likely a large wrench. But the most disturbing finding was that he had been positioned while his body was still warm, held upright as the ice was built up around him. This was not a quick disposal of a body. It was a slow and calculated process of preservation. The killer had used water and snow to create a custom tomb, turning his victim into a morbid statue that would remain hidden until the spring thaw or a curious driver arrived. Over the next 2 weeks, the police discovered 7 more ice tombs at various rest areas and turnouts along the Perm-Yekaterinburg highway. In each case, a missing truck driver was found encased in a smooth, glass-like pillar of frozen snow. The victims were all positioned in lifelike poses, some standing with their hands in their pockets, others sitting on frozen logs as if taking a break. The sheer scale of the operation suggested a killer who was intimately familiar with the highway and the habits of the long-haul drivers who used it every night. The investigation focused on finding someone with access to high-powered industrial heating equipment, the kind used to thaw frozen pipes or clear heavy machinery. The precision of the ice shells required a controlled melting and refreezing process that could not be achieved with just a simple blowtorch. Detectives began to interview road maintenance crews and mechanics who worked along the route, looking for anyone who had recently quit or who had a history of conflict with the trucking community. They were looking for a man who knew how to master the cold. A breakthrough came when an undercover officer, posing as a driver with a broken-down rig, was approached at a truck stop by a man offering to sell Western-made engine parts at a fraction of their market value. The seller was a former road mechanic named Sergey, who had been fired from his job 2 years earlier after a violent altercation with a driver. Sergey lived in a small, isolated cabin just a few hundred yards from the highway, a place that was invisible to the passing traffic, but offered a perfect view of the rest areas. When the police raided Sergey's cabin, they found a workshop that was a gallery of stolen goods from the missing trucks. But the most incriminating evidence was in the shed behind the house. Inside was a large industrial heater and a series of modified water sprayers that had been used to create the ice tombs. They also found a collection of photographs Sergei had taken of his sculptures before leaving them for others to find. He had documented each victim's placement with the pride of an artist, noting the temperature and the amount of water used. Sergei did not deny the killings when he was taken into custody. He spoke with a calm, detached voice about his hatred for the arrogance of the truck drivers who treated the road workers like servants. He felt that by encasing them in ice, he was giving them a permanent place on the highway they loved so much. He viewed the extreme Siberian winter not as a hardship, but as a medium for his work. He was a man who had spent too much time in the silence of the snow, allowing his resentment to freeze into a lethal obsession. The trial was short, as the evidence against Sergei was overwhelming and his own confessions were detailed and unrepentant. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in one of Russia's most notorious high-security colonies, a place often referred to as Black Dolphin. The Snowman murders became a dark legend of the Ural highway, a story that truckers still tell each other over their radios when the winter wind begins to howl. It changed the way they viewed the rest areas, turning a place of sanctuary into a place of potential ice. As of April 2026, Sergei is reported to have passed away in prison due to natural causes related to long-term isolation. The highway between Perm and Yekaterinburg has been modernized with better lighting and more frequent patrols. But the older drivers still avoid stopping at the specific rest area where Yuri found the first mound. The ice tombs are gone, but the memory of those frozen statues remains a permanent part of the landscape. The cold in the Urals is never just a matter of weather. It is a memory of the things that can happen in the dark. The frozen silence of the Russian highway is a world away from the humid, ancient dust of an Albanian humgum. We are moving from the open expanse of the snow to the claustrophobic concrete of a bunker that was never meant to be a laboratory. We are heading to the outskirts of Tirana, where a rusted hatch led a group of teenagers into a nightmare of state-era infrastructure and private, clinical cruelty. This is the story of Bunker 4 and the echoes of a regime that refused to die with the fall of a wall. In the spring of 1995, the hills surrounding Tirana were a patchwork of wild grass and thousands of gray, concrete domes. Fatmir, a 16-year-old boy with a restless spirit, spent his afternoons wandering these hills with his two closest friends. They were the first generation to grow up after the fall of the communist regime, and the landscape felt like a giant, abandoned playground waiting to be explored. For Fatmir, the 70,000 bunkers scattered across Albania were just a part of the background, like the trees or the rocks. His father had told him stories of how they were built to defend against an invasion that never came, monuments to a paranoia that had gripped the country for decades. Now, they were mostly used by farmers to store hay or by teenagers looking for a place to hide from the sun. The boys lived in a small apartment block on the edge of the city, where the electricity was unreliable and the future felt uncertain but exciting. Fatmir spent his mornings helping his mother at the bakery, breathing in the scent of fresh bread before heading out into the hills. He dreamed of becoming a pilot one day, flying far away from the concrete domes and the heavy weight of his country's history. They often made a game of seeing who could find the most unusual bunker, looking for those hidden deep in the ravines or covered by thick ivy. On this particular Tuesday, they climbed a ridge that overlooked a valley they had never fully explored, where the grass grew tall and the air was still. Fatmir led the way, his boots kicking up dust as he scanned the horizon for a new target to conquer. Albania in the mid-90s was a place caught between the iron grip of the past and the chaotic freedom of the present. People were starting to open small businesses, and the streets of Tirana were slowly filling with imported cars and colorful advertisements. Yet, the old infrastructure of the state remained, a silent skeleton of a system that had once controlled every aspect of a person's life. Fatmir's father often spoke of the Sigurimi, the secret police who had once watched everyone from the shadows, to a boy like Fatmir. These were just ghost stories from a time that was finally over. A dark era that had no place in the new Albania. He believed that the bunkers were empty and the secrets were all gone, replaced by the noise of the television and the promise of a better life. The boys spent hours discussing what they would do when they finally left school, imagining lives in Italy or Greece, where the buildings did not look like fortresses. Fatmir enjoyed the feeling of the sun on his face and the sense of limitless space that the hills provided. He felt a deep, steady rhythm to his life, a balance between the hard work of the morning and the absolute freedom of the afternoon. He was a boy who noticed small details, like the way the wind moved through the tall grass or the specific shade of gray in the concrete. Fatmir took pride in his ability to navigate the hills without a map, relying on his memory of the land and the position of the sun. He felt like the king of a forgotten world, a world where the only rules were the ones he and his friends made for themselves. As they reached the bottom of a steep ravine, they came across a bunker that looked different from the others they had seen that day. It was a standard model number 4, a small dome designed for a 3-man crew, but it was tucked behind a dense wall of thorny bushes. Fatmir noticed that the concrete was unusually clean, without the moss or the graffiti that covered most of the other structures. The most striking detail was the heavy iron hatch that served as the entrance to the underground chamber. Most bunkers had their doors stolen for scrap metal years ago, but this one was firmly in place and had been reinforced with a new, heavy-duty padlock. The steel of the lock was bright and free of rust, suggesting that someone had placed it there very recently to keep the world out. Fatmir felt a sudden, sharp curiosity that pushed away the heat of the afternoon. He signaled for his friends to stay back as he reached out to touch the cold metal of the hatch, his fingers tracing the edge of the reinforced frame. There was no sound coming from inside the bunker, but the air around it felt strangely heavy, as if the silence was being manufactured by the concrete itself. Using a heavy iron bar they carried for prying open old crates, the boys worked together to snap the shackle of the padlock. The sound of the metal breaking was a loud, flat crack that echoed through the ravine like a gunshot. Fatmir gripped the handle and pulled with all his strength, the heavy hatch swinging open with a slow, grinding groan that made his teeth ache. Instead of the smell of damp earth and rotting hay they expected, a wave of cold, sterile air rushed out of the opening. It was the scent of a hospital or a laboratory, a sharp mix of bleach and industrial cleaning fluid that did not belong in the middle of a rural valley. Fatmir hesitated for a second, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness of the descending stairs. As they moved down into the chamber, they found that the interior had been completely transformed. The walls were lined with thick sheets of gray soundproofing foam, designed to prevent even the smallest noise from escaping the concrete shell. The floor was covered in clean, white linoleum that felt unnaturally smooth under their dusty boots, reflecting the pale light of Fatmir's flashlight. The central room was occupied by 3 narrow metal beds, each equipped with heavy leather straps at the wrists and ankles. IV stands stood next to each bed, their plastic tubes still hanging in the air like transparent snakes. Fatmir noticed that the beds were not arranged for comfort, but were bolted to the floor in a precise row, facing a small desk covered in electronic monitoring equipment. Police arrived 3 hours later after Fatmir's father had made an urgent call to the local station. The lead investigator, a veteran named Iller, stepped into the bunker and immediately felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had seen many things during the transition, but the clinical setup inside this concrete dome suggested a level of organized cruelty that he had never encountered. Iller found a stack of logbooks on the desk, their covers wrapped in protective plastic to prevent any damage. He opened the first one and saw that the entries were written in a meticulous hand, alternating between Albanian and Italian. The dates in the logs were surprisingly recent, with the last entry being recorded only 6 months earlier, long after the old regime had supposedly vanished from the land. The logs did not contain names, only numbers assigned to each of the 3 beds. They detailed physiological responses to isolation and tolerance levels for high-frequency sound, recorded in a dry, clinical tone. It was a record of human suffering presented as a scientific experiment, where the victims were nothing more than data points in a private study of the human mind under extreme, forced pressure. I often wonder how a person can write down the sound of a scream and call it acoustic data. Iller looked at the skeletal remains still chained to the beds, realizing that these people had spent their final months in a soundproofed vault, invisible to the world. The investigation revealed that the medical supplies found in the bunker had been smuggled from Western Europe between 1992 and 93. This was not a state-sponsored project from the old era, but a private chamber of horrors operated during the chaotic years after the revolution. Iller began to suspect that a former Secret Service officer had repurposed the infrastructure for a new, profitable aventure. He believed the bunker was being used to sell human services to foreign clients who wanted to conduct experiments that were illegal in their own countries. The twist came when the forensic team analyzed the Italian entries in the logbooks. They realized that the person providing the scientific oversight was likely a medical professional from across the Adriatic Sea. This was a joint venture of the shadows, where the lawlessness of a transitioning country provided the perfect cover for the most depraved impulses of the modern world to take root and grow. Just as Iller was preparing to track the origin of the medical equipment, a violent explosion rocked the valley in the middle of the night. A group of unidentified men had bypassed the police guard and tossed several incendiary devices into the bunker's hatch. The fire raged through the soundproof chamber, fueled by the foam and the chemicals, destroying every piece of evidence and every logbook within minutes. The cleanup was swift and efficient, overseen by officials from Tirana who claimed the site was too dangerous to maintain. No suspects were ever named, and no witnesses ever came forward to describe the men who had firebombed the ravine. The investigation was quietly closed due to a total loss of physical evidence, and Iller was reassigned to a different department before he could file his report. The victims in Bunker 4 remain unidentified to this day. Their stories turned to ash in a concrete tomb. They were people who had likely been taken from the streets during the chaos of the early 90s, vanished into a system that had simply changed owners rather than being dismantled. Their presence in that ravine is a reminder that some shadows are deeper than any political change can reach. As of April 2026, the site near Tirana is a sealed monument to a crime that was never officially solved. The Albanian government ordered the entrance to be filled with 10 tons of liquid concrete, ensuring that no one would ever step foot inside that chamber again. The hills are still covered in gray domes, but the one in the ravine is now just a solid, silent block of stone. Fatmir is an adult now, living in Tirana, but he still avoids the hills when the sun starts to set. He remembers the smell of the sterile air and the sound of the iron bar against the lock, a sound that marked the end of his childhood. He knows that the past isn't always behind us. Sometimes it is just waiting under our feet, locked behind a new hatch and a clean coat of concrete. Moving from the cold concrete of an Albanian bunker, we travel to the luxury high-rises of South America. We are leaving the rural ravines for a city where the most sophisticated masks are worn by the most dangerous men. We are heading to Bogotá, where a rhythmic tapping behind a library wall revealed a secret that a prestigious surgeon tried to keep hidden in a human-sized safe. In the cold, high-altitude air of Bogotá in March 1996, the luxury apartment complex of El Chico stood as a monument to success and granite-faced privacy. Inside Unit 501, a heavy mahogany bookshelf lined with gold-embossed medical journals occupied the far wall of the study, casting long, still shadows across the expensive Persian rug. Everything in the room was perfectly ordered, from the silver letter opener on the desk to the silent, climate-controlled air that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old paper. Maria, a 19-year-old student from the lush, green valleys of Antioquia, arrived in the capital city with a single suitcase and a folder full of sketches. She was a woman of quiet intensity, with dark, observant eyes, and a habit of biting her lower lip when she was thinking about a new painting. To her family back in the countryside, Maria was the shining hope, the first of 5 siblings to attend a prestigious university on a partial scholarship for fine arts. Her mother had walked her to the bus station, pressing a small, hand-carved wooden cross into her palm, and telling her that the city was a place of endless mirrors where one must never forget their own face. Maria had laughed softly, promising to write every Sunday and to send home the money she earned from her part-time job at a downtown gallery. She viewed the high-rise buildings and the crowded, rain-slicked streets of Bogotá as a vast, gray canvas waiting for her to add her own color. Life in the city was a series of rhythmic, exhausting cycles, centered around the library at the university and the quiet nights spent in her small rented room. Maria worked 3 evenings a week, meticulously cataloging old prints and helping collectors navigate the world of contemporary Colombian art. She was a person who found beauty in the structure of things, spending her lunch breaks sketching the complex architectural lines of the city's colonial cathedrals and the modern steel towers. She often spent her Sunday afternoons in the public parks, watching the families fly kites and listening to the street performers. Maria was a daughter of the soil who was slowly learning to breathe the thin, metallic air of the metropolis. Her letters home were filled with descriptions of the vibrant street murals and the taste of the local coffee, carefully omitting the loneliness that sometimes crept in when the fog rolled down from the surrounding mountains at dusk. In late 1994, Maria's financial situation became increasingly tight as the cost of art supplies and tuition began to climb. She started looking for additional work, searching through the classified ads for something that would allow her to continue her studies while supporting herself. She was a woman of fierce independence, refusing to ask her mother for help when she knew the harvest back home had been poor and the family was already struggling to make ends meet. It was during this period of growing pressure that she met the man in the charcoal gray suit, a respected member of the Bogotá medical community. He had visited the gallery several times, always dressed in perfectly tailored clothing and carrying a leather portfolio that signaled a life of extreme wealth and high-level education. He spoke with a calm, melodic voice, expressing an interest in Maria's sketches and offering her a position as a private administrative assistant at his home office. The man, known to the public as a brilliant and charitable plastic surgeon, offered a salary that was 4 times what Maria was currently earning at the gallery. He presented the work as a simple matter of organizing his patient files and managing his correspondence with international medical boards. To Maria, it felt like the miracle her mother had prayed for, a way to secure her future and perhaps even move her family into a better life within a single year. She accepted the position with a sense of profound relief, believing that the doctor's prestigious reputation was the only reference she needed to trust him. She packed her few belongings and moved into the small service quarters of the apartment in El Chico, thinking only of the money she would soon be sending home. The last letter she wrote to her mother mentioned the beautiful view of the city lights and the kindness of the man who had given her such an incredible opportunity. Luis, a 50-year-old maintenance worker with graying hair and a heavy tool belt, adjusted his wrench as he walked through the service corridor of the 5th floor. He was a man who knew the heartbeat of the building, from the hum of the elevators to the rhythmic thumping of the old boilers in the basement. He took pride in his work, finding a quiet satisfaction in the way a well-oiled machine could run for years without ever making a sound that didn't belong. On a Tuesday afternoon in early 1996, Luis stood on a ladder in the hallway outside Unit 501, trying to locate a persistent vibration in the plumbing. As he pressed his ear against the wall, he heard a sound that didn't match the mechanical rhythm of the building. It was a faint, metallic tapping, 3 short strikes, followed by a long pause. Then another 3 strikes coming from behind the solid brick and plaster of the doctor's apartment. He adjusted his position, thinking it might be a loose valve or a piece of trapped air in the water lines. but the sound was too deliberate and too consistent. It wasn't the irregular banging of a pipe, but a rhythmic communication, like the code his father had used during the telegraph days in the rural provinces. Laus felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the drafts in the service shaft, as he realized the sound was coming from a space that shouldn't exist. A search party led by the National Police entered Unit 501 48 hours later. Acting on a formal missing persons report and the strange observations of the maintenance worker, the lead investigator, a veteran named Colonel Ramirez, stood in the center of the study and looked at the massive mahogany bookshelf. He noticed that the floorboards beneath the heavy furniture were polished to a higher shine than the rest of the room, as if something frequently slid across the wood. Ramirez found a small, hidden switch tucked behind a row of leather-bound surgical manuals, its surface worn smooth by the touch of a human hand. As he pressed the mechanism, a low, electric hum filled the room, and the entire bookshelf began to slide forward on a set of motorized tracks. Behind the shelf was not a wall, but a heavy steel door with a keypad and a reinforced observation window made of bulletproof glass, looking like the entrance to a high-security bank vault. Inside the steel door was a windowless, soundproofed room that measured exactly 4 square meters. Designed with the clinical coldness of a laboratory, the walls were lined with white tile, and the air was maintained at a constant, chilly temperature by a silent ventilation system hidden in the ceiling. In the center of the room was a single metal medical bed, equipped with heavy leather straps and an array of sophisticated monitoring equipment that postdated the building's construction. Maria lay on the bed, her skin the color of parched bone and her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have no end. She was held in place by the straps, her limbs thin and weakened by over 500 days of semi-sedation and forced isolation. Next to the bed was a tray of surgical instruments and several notebooks filled with the doctor's elegant, cursive handwriting, detailing the aesthetic experiments he had been performing on her without the use of anesthesia. The surgeon had used his extensive medical knowledge to keep Maria in a state of constant, fragile consciousness, ensuring she was awake enough to feel every incision but too weak to scream or resist. He had been performing a series of unnecessary, repetitive surgeries on her face and torso, treating her body as a private canvas for his anatomical obsessions. The room was equipped with a high-definition camera system that allowed the doctor to watch her from his office at the hospital. During the search, the police discovered a second hidden compartment beneath the medical bed, containing before and after photographs of several other women who had vanished from the city. The surgeon had been using his high society connections to identify vulnerable, young women who had no family in the capital, lure them with job offers, and then erase them from the world. He had falsified death certificates and forged exit visas to convince their families that they had moved to Europe or the United States. The doctor was not at home during the raid, having been alerted by a security system that sent a signal to his pager when the bookshelf was moved. He fled toward the northern border, using a series of prearranged safe houses and false identities to evade the international manhunt that followed the discovery. For 3 weeks, the surgeon of horror became the most wanted man in South America, his polished mask finally shattered by the rhythmic tapping of a 19-year-old girl. Maria was taken to a secure military hospital, where a team of specialists worked to stabilize her physical condition and begin the long, agonizing process of psychological recovery. She could only speak in whispers, her mind still trapped in the 4 square meter safe where she had spent over a year of her life. She told the investigators that she had taught herself the Morse code she used to signal Luis by remembering the patterns of the rain on her mother's roof. The climax of the case arrived when the doctor was recognized at a luxury hotel in Panama City by a waiter who had seen his photograph on the news. He was arrested without a struggle, sitting at a table overlooking the ocean and drinking a glass of expensive white wine. When the Panamanian authorities took him into custody, he expressed no remorse, complaining only about the quality of the service and the lack of privacy in the detention center. The legal proceedings in Bogotá were a media circus, with the surgeon's defense team attempting to argue that the experiments were a form of advanced medical research conducted with the victim's consent. But the evidence found in the notebooks, the detailed records of Maria's pain, and the photographs of the other missing women was an undeniable record of a predatory mind. The surgeon was a man who viewed himself as a god of the flesh, someone who had transcended the laws of men. He was sentenced to the maximum term allowed by Colombian law, with the judge describing his actions as a betrayal of the highest order of trust. The apartment in El Chico was seized by the state and the hidden room was dismantled, though the residents of the building claimed they could still hear a faint tapping in the walls long after the unit was emptied. The surgeon was extradited back to Bogotá under heavy guard, his reputation as a healer forever replaced by the reality of his cruelty. As of April 2026, Maria has become a leading advocate for the survivors of human trafficking and domestic captivity in Colombia. She underwent dozens of reconstructive surgeries to repair the damage the doctor had done, eventually regaining her health and returning to her studies in fine arts. She now uses her sketches to tell the stories of those who are still trapped in the shadows. Her work a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against the most sophisticated monsters. The surgeon remains incarcerated in a high-security prison in the mountains outside the capital, his health reportedly failing as he approaches his 80th year. He has never issued an apology to Maria or the families of the other women whose lives he destroyed for his private pleasure. The House of Echoes in El Chico remains vacant to this day, as no one is willing to occupy a space where the bookshelf once moved to reveal a human-sized safe of steel and tile. Truth has a way of vibrating through the thickest walls if there is someone outside who is willing to listen to the rhythm. Maria survived by remembering the face her mother told her never to forget, a face that the mirrors of the city tried to steal but could not erase. The silence of the luxury high-rise was broken by a single girl with a piece of metal and a heart that refused to stop beating. Even when the lights went out, we have traveled through 12 different worlds tonight, each one a different shade of darkness. But as the rain continues to tap against your window, it is time to bring these lessons back into the light of your own life. These stories were not meant to just pass the time or give you a temporary chill. They are blueprints of how the world operates when the rules of civilization are ignored by those who walk among us. You might think that the horrors we discussed are rare, isolated events that only happen in distant places like the mountains of Peru or the basements of Pakistan. But the core of every tragedy we explored tonight was a simple moment of overlooked intuition. It usually starts with a tiny, quiet voice in the back of your mind that tells you something is not quite right, even if you cannot explain exactly why. I believe that voice is the oldest part of us, a survival mechanism that predates language itself. It is a biological alarm that rings when the patterns of the world do not align. Intuition is not a mystical gift or a psychic power. It is the fastest data processing system in the human brain. Your subconscious mind can pick up 1,000 tiny signals in a second that your conscious mind misses. When your gut tells you to leave a situation, do not stop to argue with it or look for a logical reason. The biggest mistake people make is trying to talk themselves out of their fear because they do not want to seem irrational. If you feel a sudden, cold weight in your chest while standing in an elevator or walking to your car, honor that feeling immediately. It is better to be embarrassed and safe than to be polite and a victim. One of the most dangerous weapons a predator uses is not a knife or a gun, but the social pressure to be polite. We are taught from childhood to be helpful, to answer questions from strangers, and to avoid making a scene in public. Those who wish to do us harm know this very well, and they use our own good manners as a tether to keep us in place. They rely on the fact that you do not want to be seen as rude or difficult. Politeness is a social contract, and a predator has already broken that contract before they even speak to you. If a stranger approaches you with an urgent request for help in a deserted area, Remember that a truly good person would seek help from an authority figure or a group. Someone who singles out a lone individual is often looking for a target, not a savior. You have no obligation to be nice to someone who makes you feel unsafe. I have noticed that most of the stories we covered began with a person being too helpful or too trusting of a professional mask. Danger does not always look like a shadow in an alleyway. It often looks like a well-dressed doctor, a friendly neighbor, or a helpful mechanic. These are roles we are conditioned to respect, but a title is just a piece of clothing. Always look at the physical actions of a person rather than the position they claim to hold. Take the case of the surgeon in Bogotá or the healer in Peshawar. They used their status to lower the defenses of those around them. They knew that people would ignore red flags because they didn't want to offend a respectable man. If someone is pushing your boundaries or asking you to go somewhere private, their professional status does not matter. The moment they move you from a public space to a private one, the power dynamic changes. Boundaries are not walls, they are the gates to your own safety. A person who becomes angry or defensive when you say no is someone who is planning to control you. This is a massive red flag that is often ignored in the early stages of an interaction. If a stranger offers to carry your bags or give you a ride and refuses to take no for an answer, they are testing your compliance. They are checking to see how easily they can push you. In the modern world, our greatest vulnerability is often the small, glowing screen in our hands. When you are walking through a parking lot or a dark street, your phone is a distraction that erases your surroundings. It tells a predator that you are not paying attention and that you will be easy to surprise. Put the phone in your pocket and keep your head up. You need your eyes and your ears to collect the data your intuition needs to keep you alive. Awareness is a form of armor that costs nothing but your attention. When you enter a new building or a transit hub, take 5 seconds to identify the exits. Do not just look at the way you came in. Look for the service doors, the stairwells, and the windows. In an emergency, your brain will revert to the first plan it has. If you have already visualized a path to safety, you will move while others are still standing frozen in the middle of the room. The concept of out of place is the most important signal you can learn to read. In the story of the Helsinki container, it was a simple weld that didn't belong on a shipping handle. In the Ural mountains, it was a mound of snow that was too smooth. Pay attention to the things that break the natural rhythm of your environment. If a car is parked with the engine running in a place where it shouldn't be, or if a door is unlocked that is always locked, take notice. I think we often ignore the physical environment because we are too busy thinking about our destination. But the world is constantly speaking to us through these small anomalies. A predator needs a predictable environment to operate. When you show that you are observant and that you are scanning your surroundings, you become a difficult target. Predators are looking for the path of least resistance, not a challenge that might lead to their own discovery. Another common trap is the forced teaming tactic. This is when someone uses the word we or us to make you feel like you are in the same boat as them. Phrases like, "we need to get this done," or "our problem is almost solved," are designed to create a false sense of intimacy and obligation. It is a way of bypassing your natural suspicion by making you feel like a partner. If a stranger tries to join their fate to yours, step back and re-establish the distance. Predators also use the loan shark technique, where they do an unsolicited favor for you so that you feel you owe them something. It could be as small as holding a door or picking up a dropped item. They then use that tiny debt to ask for something much larger, like coming inside your home or getting into your car. Realize that a gift you did not ask for does not require a payment. You owe nothing to someone who forces a favor upon you. The most important thing you can do tonight is to check your locks, not just because it is a habit, but because you understand the value of a physical barrier. A lock is a piece of time. It gives you the seconds you need to wake up, to call for help, and to prepare. Never leave your safety to chance or the hope that the world is a kind place. The world is a beautiful place, but it is also a place where shadows exist. And those shadows require a wall. Trusting your instincts is a form of self-respect. It means believing that your observations and your feelings are valid. Do not let the fear of being crazy or paranoid stop you from taking care of yourself. People who have survived terrifying encounters often say that they knew something was wrong long before the violence began. They just didn't want to admit it to themselves. Admit it to yourself early and often. It is the only way to stay ahead of the dark. I believe that every one of you has a predator detection system that is older than the mountains. You just have to give yourself permission to listen to it. The noise of the city and the pressure of social life try to drown out that quiet ansiam. But tonight, in the silence of the rain, you can hear it clearly. It is the part of you that knows when the air changes. It is the part of you that is always looking at the exits. Keep that part of you awake. As you settle into your bed, think about the stories of the hikers in the Blue Mountains or the school in Goma. They remind us that the world can be unpredictable and that some things remain unexplained. But they also remind us that we must be present in every moment. Do not drift through your life as if you are a passenger. Be the navigator of your own safety. Know where you are, who is around you, and what the ground feels like beneath your feet. These 12 stories are over now, but the world outside your door is still turning. The rain will eventually stop, and the sun will come up, bringing with it 1,000 new interactions and 1,000 new choices. Make each choice with a clear mind and a sharp eye. You are the only person who can truly look after your own life. Do not delegate that responsibility to luck or to the politeness of strangers. Hold on to your own power with both hands. If you found value in these warnings and the stories that came before them, please leave a comment and share your own experiences with intuition. It helps the community stay vigilant and reminds us that we are not alone in our caution. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to stay updated on our future journeys into the dark. I have many more stories to tell, and I would like you to be here to hear them. We are just getting started. Check your locks one last time. Make sure the windows are secure and the lights are low. The white noise will continue for a little longer to help you sleep. So just relax and let the lessons of the night settle in. You are safe now, but the world is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep deeply and stay aware. I will be back soon with more true stories about the strange and the mysterious. Until then, take care of yourself. Treat the like button like a heavy iron bolt on a door in the middle of a storm. It is a small thing that keeps everything in place and ensures that the light stays on for the next person who comes looking for shelter. Just one click is all it takes to keep the channel moving forward. Thank you for spending your night with me. The rain is slowing down now, and the silence is returning. It is time for us to rest. Good night.